This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was starting to feel drowsy, so I cracked the window to let in some cool night air and turned up the radio. That's when I saw the flickering lights up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a car on the side of the road with its hazards blinking. The front end was crumpled against a tree just off the shoulder. My heart started racing as I slowed down. Should I stop? What if someone was hurt and needed help? But it was the middle of the night on a lonely stretch of road. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind. I decided I couldn't just drive by if someone might be injured. I pulled over about 50 feet behind the crashed car and put on my own hazards. Grabbing my cell phone, I got out and cautiously approached. "Hello?" I called out. "Is everyone okay? Do you need help?" There was no response. As I got closer, I could see the driver's side door was open, but the car appeared empty. A chill ran down my spine. Something about this didn't feel right. I was about 10 feet from the car when I heard gravel crunching behind me. I spun around to see two men emerging from the shadows by the tree line. They were both large and muscular, wearing dark clothes. One had a baseball bat. Well, looks like we caught ourselves a good Samaritan," the one with the bat sneered. My blood ran cold as I realized I'd walked right into their trap. They had staged this whole scene to lure in unsuspecting drivers. I started backing away slowly. "Listen, guys, I don't want any trouble. I'm just going to get back in my car and leave, okay?" "Oh, I don't think so," said the other man, pulling out a knife. "Hand over your wallet and keys. Nice and easy now." My mind was racing. I knew I couldn't outrun them to my car, and even if I made it, they could easily smash the window before I got the engine started. I had to think fast. Just then, I heard a vehicle approaching. Headlights appeared in the distance, coming our way. It was like a miracle. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted toward the oncoming car, waving my arms frantically. "Help! Help!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. I heard angry shouts and pounding footsteps behind me as the two men gave chase. The approaching vehicle, a semi-truck as it turned out, began blaring its horn. I ran into the middle of the road, still waving and yelling. The truck wasn't slowing down. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was about to be hit. But at the last second, I dove to the side as the massive vehicle roared past, missing me by inches. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. The two men had retreated back into the shadows to avoid being seen. The truck's brake lights came on as the driver finally processed what he'd seen and started to slow down. I ran after the truck, not daring to look back. "Wait, please wait," I yelled. Mercifully, the truck came to a stop about a quarter-mile down the road. I sprinted toward it like my life depended on it, because it probably did. As I reached the passenger side, the door swung open. "What in tarnation is going on?" demanded the grizzled old truck driver. "I damn near hit you, boy." Out of breath, I gasped out an explanation of what had happened. The driver's eyes widened as he realized how close I'd come to being robbed or worse. "Well, get in, quick," he said. "We'll call the cops once we're safely down the road a ways." I didn't need to be told twice. I clambered up into the cab, glancing nervously behind us, but there was no sign of the two men. As we pulled away, I finally allowed myself to breathe a shaky sigh of relief. "That was some quick thinking back there," the driver said. "Running out in front of me like that. Crazy, but it probably saved your life." I nodded, still too rattled to speak. We drove in silence for a few minutes as the adrenaline slowly drained from my system, leaving me feeling utterly exhausted. "I'm John, by the way," the driver finally said. "Tom," I replied, "and thanks. I don't even want to think about what might have happened if you hadn't come along when you did." John grunted. "Don't mention it, but you'd best be more careful in the future. Stopping to help strangers in the middle of the night, that's just asking for trouble these days." We found a truck stop about 20 miles down the road and pulled over to call the police. I gave them a full report of what had happened, including descriptions of the two men and the location of the staged accident. The officer I spoke to said they'd send some units to check it out, but I could tell from his tone that he didn't expect to find much. John kindly offered to let me stay in his truck while we waited for my sister to come pick me up. I was still too shaken to get behind the wheel myself. As we sat drinking bad vending machine coffee, John told me about other stories he'd heard of similar roadside traps targeting Good Samaritans. "It's a shame," he said, shaking his head. "Makes folks scared to help each other. But that's the world we live in now." When my sister arrived an hour later, I thanked John profusely for everything. He brushed it off gruffly, but I could tell he was pleased to have helped. "You take care now," he said as I climbed down from the cab. "And remember, trust your gut. If something don't feel right, it probably ain't." I nodded, knowing it was advice I'd never forget. As I watched John's taillights disappear into the night, I reflected on how differently things could have gone. One split-second decision had likely saved me from a terrible fate. The police never did catch the men who had set the trap, but the officer I spoke with later told me they'd found evidence of the staged accident scene, confirming my story. Apparently similar incidents had been reported in neighboring counties as well. To this day, I'm extra cautious when driving alone at night, and while I'd like to think I'd still stop to help someone truly in need, I'm much more wary now. That night taught me a hard lesson about the darkness that sometimes lurks in human nature. But it also showed me that there are still good people out there, like John, willing to help a stranger in trouble. I often think about what might have happened if that truck hadn't come along when it did. It's chilling to realize how close I came to becoming just another victim, another cautionary tale. Now, whenever I pass a car on the side of the road, I say a little prayer for the safety of everyone involved, and I keep driving. "Hey man, I really need to stop soon," I said to Jake. "I'm about to fall asleep at the wheel here." Jake nodded groggily. "Yeah, me too. Let's find somewhere to pull over and rest for a bit." We drove for another 15 minutes or so before finally spotting a sign for a rest stop coming up. I breathed a sigh of relief as I took the exit. The rest area was set back from the highway, surrounded by dense woods. As we pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, I noticed there were only a couple other cars there, an old pickup truck and a beat-up sedan. I parked near the restroom building and cut the engine. The silence was eerie after hours of road noise. Jake and I sat there for a moment, neither of us eager to get out of the safety of the car. "This place is kinda creepy," Jake muttered. I laughed nervously. "Yeah, definite horror movie vibes, but I really gotta pee, so..." We reluctantly climbed out of the car, stretching our stiff limbs. The air was chilly and damp. Gravel crunched under our feet as we made our way to the restrooms. I finished up quickly and was washing my hands when I heard the bathroom door open behind me. In the mirror, I saw two men enter. They were both tall and burly, wearing dark clothes and baseball caps pulled low over their eyes. A chill ran down my spine. Something about them immediately set off alarm bells. I dried my hands and turned to leave, keeping my eyes down. As I reached for the door, one of the men stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Where you headed, buddy?" he asked in a low, menacing voice. My heart started racing. Just, back to my car, I stammered. My friend's waiting for me. The man chuckled darkly. I don't think so. You're coming with us. That's when I noticed the gun in his hand, partially concealed by his jacket. Pure terror flooded through me. This couldn't be happening. Look, take my wallet, my phone, whatever you want, I said, my voice shaking. Just let me go. The second man spoke up. We don't want your shit. We want you. My mind was reeling. Were they going to rob me, kidnap me, kill me? I felt paralyzed with fear. The first man grabbed my arm roughly. Let's go, and don't try anything stupid. They started dragging me towards the door. I tried to dig in my heels, but they were much stronger than me. As we exited the bathroom, I desperately scanned the parking lot, praying Jake was still out there. To my immense relief, I spotted him leaning against our car, looking at his phone. Our eyes met, and his expression immediately changed to one of confusion and concern. Jake, run, I yelled. They have a gun. Everything happened so fast after that. Jake's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with determination. He bent down and scooped up a large rock from the gravel. In one fluid motion, he hurled it directly at the man holding the gun. The rock struck him square in the face with a sickening crunch. He cried out in pain and staggered backwards, losing his grip on me. His gun clattered to the ground. I took advantage of the momentary chaos and wrenched myself free from the other man's grasp. I sprinted towards Jake and our car as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard angry shouts and pounding footsteps. Jake had already jumped in the driver's seat and started the engine. I dove into the passenger side, slamming the door shut just as one of the men reached us. He pounded on the window, his face contorted with rage. Go! 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 I screamed. Jake floored it, peeling out of the parking lot. Gravel sprayed up behind us as we fishtailed onto the access road. In the rearview mirror, I saw the men running back to their truck. Holy shit, Jake gasped as we merged onto the highway. What the hell just happened? I was shaking uncontrollably, adrenaline coursing through my body. I don't know, I stammered. Those guys, they came into the bathroom and grabbed me. They had a gun. I think they were trying to kidnap me or something. Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Jesus Christ, are you okay? Did they hurt you? I took stock of myself, still in shock. No, I don't think so. Just scared out of my mind. If you hadn't been there. I trailed off, not wanting to think about what might have happened. Jake reached over and squeezed my shoulder. It's okay, man. We got away. You're safe now. I nodded mutely, trying to calm my racing heart. We drove in tense silence for a while, both scanning the road behind us for any sign of pursuit. After about 20 minutes with no headlights following us, we started to relax slightly. Should we call the police? Jake asked. I considered it, but shook my head. And tell them what? We don't even know what county we're in, and we didn't get a good look at the guys or their license plate. I just want to get home. Jake nodded in understanding. We drove through the rest of the night, only stopping once to get gas at a brightly lit station right off the highway. Neither of us wanted to risk pulling over anywhere isolated again. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, we finally reached our hometown. Jake dropped me off at my apartment, making sure I got inside safely before heading home himself. I collapsed onto my bed, utterly drained. But even though I was exhausted, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men's menacing faces. I kept replaying the events in my mind, imagining all the horrible outcomes that could have happened. Why did they target me? What did they want? The questions swirled endlessly in my head. I tossed and turned for hours before finally falling into a fitful sleep plagued by nightmares. In the days and weeks that followed, I remained on edge. I jumped at every unexpected sound. I avoided going out alone, especially at night. I installed new locks and an alarm system in my apartment. Jake and I talked about that night often, trying to make sense of it. We scoured news reports for any similar incidents in the area, but found nothing. It was like those men had appeared out of nowhere and then vanished without a trace. Part of me wonders if we imagined or exaggerated the whole thing. But then I remember the cold metal of the gun pressed against my side, the terror in Jake's eyes as he threw that rock, the pounding of my heart as we sped away into the night. It was all too real. To this day, I can't drive past a rest stop without my palms getting sweaty and my chest tightening with anxiety. I know the odds of something like that happening again are astronomically low, but the fear lingers. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of those men's voices in my ears. "You're coming with us." I don't know what they wanted or why they chose me, and I hope I never find out. All I know is that I'm incredibly lucky to have escaped, thanks to Jake's quick thinking. I try to focus on that, on the fact that I survived, that I'm safe now. But a small part of me will always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if danger is lurking just around the corner. I've never shared this story publicly before. It still feels surreal, like something out of a movie rather than my actual life. But I needed to get it off my chest. Writing it all out has been cathartic in a way. To anyone reading this, please be careful out there. Trust your instincts, be aware of your surroundings, and never take your safety for granted. You never know when a routine pit stop could turn into a nightmare. I'm still processing what happened that night. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with it, but I'm grateful every day that I made it out alive. And I'll never forget the terror of those moments when I thought my life was about to change forever. Stay safe out there, everyone, and maybe think twice before stopping at an isolated rest area in the middle of the night. You never know who or what might be waiting there in the shadows. When the car pulled up, I quickly got in the back seat without paying much attention. "Hi, I'm Rachel," I said absently, focused on my phone. The driver grunted in response and started driving. It wasn't until about 10 minutes later that I realized something was off. I glanced up and noticed we were heading out of the city, away from my apartment. I think you might have taken a wrong turn," I said hesitantly. "My place is actually back that way." The driver didn't respond or slow down. A chill ran through me as I realized he was deliberately ignoring me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there must be some misunderstanding. "Sir, did you hear me? We're going the wrong way." Still no response. My heart started racing as panic set in. I pulled up the map on my phone, confirming we were now miles off course and headed into an isolated area. "Stop the car right now," I said forcefully. "Let me out immediately or I'm calling the police." The driver finally spoke, his voice cold and threatening. "Put the phone down and shut up if you know what's good for you." Terror gripped me as I realized this wasn't a mistake. I was being kidnapped. I frantically tried to open the door, but the child locks were on. The windows wouldn't roll down either. I was trapped. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. We were on a dark country road with nothing around for miles. Even if I managed to call 911, help would never arrive in time. I considered trying to grab the steering wheel or attack the driver, but he was a large man, and I knew I'd likely just get myself killed. My only hope was to try to escape if we stopped somewhere. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, I saw the glow of lights ahead. A gas station. My heart leapt. This might be my only chance. As we pulled up to the pump, I prepared myself to make a run for it. The driver got out to fill up the tank. The moment I heard his door close, I lunged for the handle and threw myself out of the car. I sprinted towards the convenience store, screaming at the top of my lungs. "Help! Please help me! Call the police!" The startled attendant rushed out, eyes wide as he took in my hysterical state. I heard the squeal of tires behind me as the driver peeled out of the lot. He tried to kidnap me," I gasped out between sobs. "Please call the police. He's getting away." The attendant quickly ushered me inside and locked the door, grabbing the phone to call 911. I collapsed into a chair, shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline wore off and the reality of what just happened hit me. The police arrived within minutes, but of course the driver was long gone by then. I gave them my statement through tears, describing every detail I could remember about the car and driver. They assured me they would do everything possible to track him down. One of the officers drove me home, following me inside to make sure my apartment was secure. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my couch, jumping at every little sound. Sleep was impossible. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews and paralyzing anxiety. I couldn't bring myself to leave my apartment. The thought of getting in another car filled me with terror. I kept replaying those awful moments in my mind, imagining all the horrific things that could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. The what-ifs haunted me. It's been weeks now, and the police still haven't found the guy. They think he may have been using a stolen identity on the rideshare app. The company claims they do background checks, but clearly their system failed catastrophically. I'm seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma, but I still have nightmares almost every night. I've deleted all the rideshare apps from my phone, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to use one again. Even getting in a regular taxi makes me nervous now. Part of me wants to warn everyone about the dangers, to tell them never to trust strangers or get in unfamiliar cars. But I know that's not realistic. The world can't just stop because something terrible almost happened to me. I'm trying to move forward and not let fear control my life, but it's hard. That night changed me in ways I'm still struggling to process. I'm more cautious now, more aware of potential dangers lurking in everyday situations. Sometimes I find myself studying the faces of drivers, taxi drivers, delivery people, searching for any hint of malicious intent. I know it's irrational, but I can't help it. That lingering feeling of vulnerability is always there now. I wonder about that driver sometimes. Was I his first victim? His only one? Or are there other women out there who weren't as lucky as me? The thought makes me sick. I'm sharing my story as a warning, I guess, to remind people to stay alert and trust their instincts, to always pay attention to your surroundings and have an escape plan. You never know when a mundane situation might turn dangerous. I'm grateful to be alive and safe, but I'm also angry that one person's evil actions have stolen my sense of security and peace of mind. I don't know if I'll ever fully feel safe again. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time, trying to reclaim my life and not let fear win. It's a constant battle, but I'm determined to come out stronger on the other side of this trauma. To anyone reading this who's been through something similar, you're not alone. And to those who haven't, please, please be careful out there. The world can be a dangerous place, even in situations that seem safe. Stay vigilant and trust your gut. It might just save your life like it did mine. I still don't understand why this happened to me or what that driver's intentions were. Was it random or was I specifically targeted? These questions may never be answered. All I know is that I'm incredibly lucky to have escaped, and I'll never take my safety for granted again. Sometimes I find myself staring at the app on my phone, my finger hovering over the delete button. Part of me wants to erase all traces of that night from my life, but another part feels like I need to keep it as a reminder of what happened, of how close I came to disaster, and of how precious and fragile life can be. I've started taking self-defense classes, trying to regain a sense of control and empowerment. It helps a little, but I know deep down that no amount of training could have prepared me for that situation. The element of surprise and the confined space of the car left me with few options. Friends have suggested I get a car of my own, but the thought of driving alone at night terrifies me now. I've become reliant on colleagues and friends for rides, always making sure someone knows where I am and who I'm with. The hardest part is the unpredictability of the flashbacks. I'll be fine one moment, and the next I'm right back in that car, feeling the panic and helplessness wash over me. A car backfiring, the smell of gasoline, even seeing a rideshare sticker in a window. Any of these can trigger a flood of awful memories. I've started volunteering with a local organization that supports survivors of violence and trauma. Helping others has become a way for me to process my own experience and find some meaning in what happened. It doesn't erase the pain, but it gives me purpose. As time passes, the raw terror of that night has faded somewhat, replaced by a constant low-level anxiety that colors everything I do. I'm working on finding a balance between staying safe and actually living my life. It's not easy, but I refuse to let that driver steal any more from me than he already has. I hope that by sharing my story, I can help someone else avoid a similar situation. Always trust your instincts, be aware of your surroundings, and have a plan. It might seem paranoid, but it could save your life. I'm living proof of that. The rest area was pretty deserted when I arrived, just a couple of semi-trucks parked off to the side. I pulled into a spot near the restroom building, set an alarm on my phone for 30 minutes, and settled in to catch some shut-eye. I must have been more exhausted than I realized, because I zonked out almost immediately. When my alarm went off, I groggily sat up and rubbed my eyes. As I became more alert, something felt off. The interior of the car seemed different somehow. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but then I noticed the air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, a little pine tree shape that definitely hadn't been there before. My heart started to race as I looked around more closely. This wasn't my car. The upholstery was a different color. There were fast food wrappers on the floor that weren't mine. The radio was tuned to a country station I never listened to. What the hell was going on? I scrambled out of the vehicle in a panic, my mind reeling. Had I somehow gotten into the wrong car when I arrived? No, that was impossible. I distinctly remembered locking my doors before I fell asleep. I walked around the exterior, growing more confused by the second. It was the same make and model as my car, even the same dark blue color. But the license plate was different. My first instinct was to call the police, but as I reached for my phone, I realized with horror that it wasn't in my pocket. Neither were my keys or wallet. They must still be in my actual car, wherever that was. I was totally stranded. As I stood there trying to figure out what to do, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Two men were walking briskly towards me from the far end of the parking lot. Something about their purposeful stride and intense expressions sent a chill down my spine. Call it paranoia, but I had a sinking feeling they were coming for me. Without really thinking, I ducked back into the strange car I'd woken up in. To my shock, The key was in the ignition. I turned it and the engine roared to life. The two men started running now, shouting something I couldn't make out. Hands shaking, I threw the car into drive and peeled out of the parking spot. I sped out of the rest area and back onto the highway, my heart pounding. In the rearview mirror, I saw the men run to another vehicle and peel out after me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had they somehow swapped my car for this one while I was sleeping? Why? What did they want with me? As I pushed the accelerator to the floor, trying to put distance between us, I noticed a strong chemical smell coming from the back seat. Risking a glance over my shoulder, I saw several large duffel bags piled up. A horrible realization dawned on me. Were those filled with drugs? The car that was chasing me was gaining ground fast. I weaved through traffic, pushing well over 100 mph, but they were still closing in. Up ahead, I saw signs for an exit with several gas stations and fast food places. Making a split-second decision, I cut across 3 lanes of traffic and took the exit ramp at the last possible second. I blew through the stop sign at the end of the ramp and swerved into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. Killing the headlights, I whipped around to the back of the building and cut the engine. I slunk down in the seat, praying they hadn't seen where I went. A few seconds later, I heard the roar of an engine as a car flew past on the road behind the diner. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity. When I was fairly certain they were gone, I let out a shaky exhale and tried to collect my thoughts. I needed to get help, but I had no phone and no money. I couldn't just walk into the diner and start telling this insane story. They'd think I was a lunatic, or worse, assume I was involved with the drugs somehow. I also couldn't risk driving the car again in case those men were still searching the area. After weighing my options, I decided to lay low in the car for a while longer, then try to find a payphone to call the police once it was light out. As I waited, I carefully examined the car's interior, looking for any clues about what was going on. In the glove compartment, I found some crumpled receipts and a half-empty pack of cigarettes. Nothing particularly illuminating. But when I popped open the center console, my breath caught in my throat. It was stuffed full of bundles of cash, tens of thousands of dollars at least. What had I gotten myself mixed up in? Drugs, money. This had to be some kind of major criminal operation. And somehow I'd ended up smack in the middle of it. I felt sick to my stomach. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I steeled my nerves and prepared to make my move. I figured I could sneak around to the front of the diner, explain to the staff that my car broke down and I needed to use their phone to call for help. Hopefully I could reach the police before those men caught up with me again. I was about to open the car door when a sharp rap on the window made me nearly jump out of my skin. I whipped my head around to see a police officer peering in at me, flashlight in hand. For a split second, I was flooded with relief, until I remembered I was sitting in a car full of drugs and stolen money. How could I possibly explain this? "Step out of the vehicle, sir," the officer said firmly. Hands trembling, I complied. "Officer, I can explain," I started to say, but he cut me off. "We've been looking for this vehicle. It was reported stolen from the Highway 27 rest stop a few hours ago." He eyed me suspiciously. "Care to explain how you ended up with it?" The words came pouring out of me in a frantic jumble. I told him everything, falling asleep in my own car, waking up in this one, being chased by the two men, discovering the drugs and money. I must have sounded completely unhinged, but I was beyond caring at that point. To my immense surprise and relief, the officer's demeanor softened as I spoke. "Slow down, son," he said. "I think I know what's going on here. We've been tracking a drug trafficking ring operating in this area. Looks like you got caught up in one of their car switching schemes." He explained that the criminals would look for lone vehicles at rest stops, then use stolen key fobs to unlock them and swap contents with another nearly identical vehicle. They used this method to transport drugs and money while evading detection. In this case, it seemed they had accidentally swapped with an occupied vehicle, mine. More police cars arrived as the officer questioned me further and examined the contents of the car. They found my wallet, keys, and phone stashed in one of the duffel bags. One of the officers pulled up the report for my stolen vehicle and confirmed all the details matched. "Looks like the perpetrators realized their mistake and were trying to rectify it when you took off," the first officer told me. "You're lucky you got away. These aren't people you want to tangle with." They took my statement and gathered all the evidence from the car. One of the officers gave me a ride to the local station so I could fill out a formal report. A few hours later, they had tracked down my actual car abandoned at a truck stop about 50 miles away. By that afternoon, I was finally reunited with my own vehicle, shaken but unharmed. The police advised me to be extra vigilant going forward, as the criminals were still at large. They also warned me that I might be called to testify if they managed to apprehend the suspects. As I got back on the road to continue my much-delayed trip, my mind was reeling. I couldn't believe how close I'd come to being caught up in something so dangerous. Every car on the highway suddenly seemed suspicious. I found myself checking my rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting to see those two men appear again at any moment. It's been a few months now, and the police still haven't made any arrests in the case. Sometimes I lie awake at night, wondering if those criminals are still out there, angry that I disrupted their operation. I'm always extra careful to park in well-lit areas now, and I never sleep in my car at rest stops anymore. I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly terrible that night. The whole experience left me shaken and paranoid in a way I never was before. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. You never know what might be happening right under your nose, even in seemingly innocent places, like a quiet rest stop in the middle of the night. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and be careful out there. I was starting to feel drowsy, so I rolled down the window to let the cool night air help keep me alert. That's when I first noticed the flashing lights up ahead. As I got closer, I could see what looked like road construction signs and orange cones funneling traffic into a single lane. A man in a reflective vest was standing by the cones, waving a flashlight to direct me. I slowed down, thinking it was odd to have road work going on in the middle of the night, but figured they must be trying to avoid disrupting daytime traffic. The man gestured for me to roll down my window as I approached. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir," he said. "We've got a crew working on a washout about a mile up. Going to need you to take this detour." He pointed to a dirt road branching off into the woods. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Maybe it was how isolated we were, or the late hour for road work. But the man seemed official enough in his vest and hard hat, so I nodded and turned onto the detour as directed. The dirt road was rough and unmarked. My headlights barely penetrated the thick forest pressing in on both sides. After about 5 minutes of slow driving, doubt really started to creep in. Shouldn't I have reached the main road again by now? There were no signs or any indication of ongoing construction. Just as I was considering turning around, I came around a bend and saw several vehicles blocking the narrow road ahead. Before I could react, bright floodlights suddenly blinded me. I slammed on the brakes as shadowy figures swarmed my car. My doors were yanked open and rough hands grabbed me, dragging me out onto the ground. I tried to struggle, but someone hit me hard in the stomach, knocking the wind out of me. They zip-tied my hands behind my back and threw a hood over my head. I could hear them ransacking my car as I lay there gasping for air. The initial shock was wearing off and blind panic was setting in. This couldn't be happening. I started yelling for help, but a boot to my ribs cut me off. "Shut up and stay down if you want to live," a gruff voice warned. I don't know how long I lay there in the dirt, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Eventually, I heard them finish with my car and gather around me. "All right, let's get him up," someone said. Hands grabbed me and hauled me to my feet. They marched me stumbling through the woods for what felt like forever. I kept tripping over roots and rocks, earning rough shoves each time. Finally, we stopped and I was forced to sit on the ground, back against what felt like a tree. They used more zip ties to secure me to it. The hood was yanked off my head and I blinked in the glare of flashlights. There were 5 men, all wearing ski masks. One of them crouched in front of me. "Here's how this is going to work," he said coldly. "We're going to ask you some questions. You're going to answer honestly and quickly. Do that, and maybe you get to go home when we're done. Lie or give us trouble, and you'll wish we'd just killed you on the road. Understand?" I nodded frantically, still too terrified to speak. For the next hour, they grilled me about my bank accounts, credit cards, ATM pins, online passwords, everything. I told them whatever they wanted to know. I just wanted it to be over. When they were satisfied, the apparent leader stood up. "All right, boys, let's go clean him out. You, don't go anywhere." He chuckled at his own joke as they melted into the darkness, leaving me alone tied to the tree. As soon as they were gone, survival instinct kicked in. I started twisting and contorting, trying desperately to slip free of the zip ties. The plastic dug painfully into my wrists, but I kept at it, ignoring the blood I could feel trickling down my hands. Just when I was about to give up hope, I felt the zip tie on my right wrist give slightly. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I gave one final wrench and my hand popped free. From there, I was able to reach the knife I always kept clipped in my back pocket. My fingers were numb and slippery with blood, but I managed to flip it open and saw through the remaining restraints. I knew I only had minutes before they returned. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly and quietly. I had no idea which direction would lead me back to the road, so I simply picked a direction and started creeping through the pitch-black forest. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that endless dark woods. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent spikes of terror through me, certain they were right behind me. But I kept going, one agonizing step at a time. Just when despair was starting to set in, I caught a faint glow through the trees ahead. Hope surged as I quickened my pace. I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing with a farmhouse, warm light spilling from its windows. I sprinted to the front door and started pounding on it frantically. "Help! Please, someone help me!" After what felt like an eternity, the porch light flicked on and the door cracked open. An elderly man peered out suspiciously. "Please," I gasped. "I've been kidnapped. They're after me. I need help." He took in my wild appearance, clothes torn and dirty, hands bloody from the zip ties. His eyes widened, and he quickly ushered me inside, locking the door behind us. "Martha," he called out, "call the sheriff now." The next few hours passed in a blur. Police swarmed the area but found no trace of my attackers. They took my statement and had paramedics check me over. The kind elderly couple, John and Martha, insisted I stay with them until my family could come get me in the morning. As I lay in their guest room that night, utterly exhausted but too wired and traumatized to sleep, I kept replaying the whole ordeal in my mind. How could something like this happen? How many other innocent drivers had fallen for their trap? The police said there had been reports of similar incidents in the region, but they'd never managed to catch the perpetrators. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about those terrifying hours in the woods. I can't bring myself to drive on back roads anymore, especially at night. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'm still tied to that tree in the darkness. I know I'm incredibly lucky to have escaped, but a part of me is still there in those woods, wondering if I'll ever truly feel safe again. I hesitated for a moment, as that area wasn't the safest, especially late at night. But fares had been slow lately, and I could use the extra cash, so I accepted the ride and headed to the pickup location. As I pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, I saw a lone figure standing in the shadows near the office. A chill ran down my spine, but I chalked it up to paranoia and unlocked the doors. A tall man in a dark hoodie slid into the back seat, mumbling an address that was way out in the sticks, nearly an hour's drive. I punched it into the GPS and pulled out of the lot, stealing glances at my passenger in the rearview mirror. His face was obscured by the hood, but I could see his eyes darting around nervously. We drove in tense silence for about 20 minutes before the man finally spoke up. "Change of plans. Take me to Willow Creek Road instead." His voice was low and gravelly. I nodded and adjusted the route, even though alarm bells were going off in my head. Willow Creek Road was an isolated country lane with nothing but abandoned farmhouses for miles. As we got further from the city, my unease grew. The man kept fidgeting and muttering to himself, occasionally letting out a humorless chuckle. At one point, I saw him pull something metallic out of his pocket before quickly stuffing it away again. My heart was racing, but I tried to keep my composure and act normal. About 10 minutes from our destination, he leaned forward and growled, "Pull over here." We were on a pitch-black stretch of road flanked by dense woods. Every instinct screamed at me not to stop, but I was terrified of provoking him. I eased onto the shoulder, my hands shaking on the wheel. "Turn off the car and give me the keys," he demanded. I froze, realizing this was the moment I dreaded. In a burst of desperate inspiration, I pretended to fumble with the keys, letting them fall to the floorboard. As I leaned down to retrieve them, I discreetly pressed the panic button on my hidden emergency fob. Suddenly, bright flashing lights erupted from all sides of the taxi, accompanied by a piercing alarm. The man recoiled in shock, momentarily stunned. In that split second, I threw the car into drive and floored it, tires squealing as I peeled away. I heard an enraged roar and the sound of something hitting the back window. Glancing in the mirror, I saw the man had pulled a gun. Adrenaline surging, I swerved erratically down the dark road, making myself a harder target. A shot rang out, and my rear windshield shattered. I ducked low in my seat, driving mostly blind as I careened around curves. After a harrowing few minutes that felt like hours, I spotted a gas station up ahead, its lights a beacon of hope. I screeched into the lot, horn blaring, and threw myself out of the car. The attendant took one look at my terrified face and bullet-riddled taxi before locking the doors and calling 911. Cowering behind the counter, we waited an agonizing 15 minutes for the police to arrive. I gave them a statement through chattering teeth, describing the man and the harrowing escape. They took off to search the area, but found no trace of my would-be attacker. In the days that followed, I was a nervous wreck. I jumped at every sound and couldn't sleep without the lights on. The police investigation turned up nothing. The motel had no record or security footage of the man, and no prints were found in my cab. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I've started driving again, but only day shifts in busy areas. I'm hypervigilant about checking my passengers and trusting my gut. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of the job had finally made me crack. But then I look at my taxi, repaired but forever changed, and I know it was all too real. That night haunts me still. Who was that man? What were his intentions? I'm grateful to have escaped, but the questions gnaw at me. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, waiting for his next victim. All I can do is stay alert and hope I never cross paths with pure evil again. I was tired but alert, singing along softly to the radio to keep myself awake. That's when I first noticed the headlights appear in my rearview mirror. I didn't think much of it at first, just another traveler on the lonely road. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the car behind me wasn't passing or falling back. It maintained a steady distance, close enough that I could make out the shape of an SUV in the darkness. A faint sense of unease began to creep over me. Why weren't they passing? There was no other traffic. They could easily go around me if they wanted to. I increased my speed slightly, but the SUV sped up to match. My palms started to sweat on the steering wheel. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just someone heading to the same area as me. But something about the way they hugged my bumper made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being deliberately followed. To test my theory, I slowed down considerably, well below the speed limit. The SUV slowed right along with me, maintaining that same unnervingly close distance. My heart started to race. This definitely wasn't normal driving behavior. I sped back up, pushing 10 over the limit now. The SUV accelerated smoothly, never letting me increase the gap between us. Panic began to set in as I realized this person was intentionally staying on my tail. But why? What did they want? My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was it a serial killer looking for a victim? A group of criminals planning to run me off the road and rob me? I'd heard stories of people being followed and attacked on isolated stretches of highway. I never thought it would happen to me. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, thinking to call 911, but there was no signal out here in the sticks. I was on my own. Adrenaline surged through me as fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. I pressed down hard on the accelerator, the engine roaring as I shot forward. But it was no use. The SUV easily kept pace, those menacing headlights filling my mirrors. I started scanning desperately for any signs of civilization, praying for a gas station or even a house where I could pull in. But there was nothing but empty fields and forest on either side of the road, stretching endlessly into the night. Sweat trickled down my back as I white-knuckled the steering wheel. How long had they been following me now? 15 minutes? 30? It felt like hours. The once comforting darkness now felt sinister and oppressive. I flinched as the SUV suddenly swerved slightly, as if the driver had nodded off. Were they toying with me, trying to scare me into making a mistake? My mind conjured images of masked figures with weapons just waiting for me to lose control. Tears of fear and frustration welled in my eyes. I felt so helpless, like a mouse being stalked by a cat. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide out here in the middle of nowhere. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, I spotted a glow on the horizon. Lights! My heart leapt with hope. As I got closer, I made out the illuminated sign of a 24-hour truck stop. I'd never been so happy to see a gas station in my life. I took the exit at the last second, tires squealing. To my immense relief, the parking lot was fairly busy with several semis and cars. I screeched to a halt right in front of the store entrance and bolted inside, looking back fearfully over my shoulder. The SUV had followed me off the highway, but now it cruised slowly past the gas station without stopping. I caught a glimpse of a male driver, but couldn't make out any details in the shadows. He stared coldly in my direction as he drove by, then disappeared into the night. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline drained away. The confused clerk asked if I was okay, and I babbled out my story between sobs. He called the police, who arrived quickly to take my statement. They searched the area, but found no sign of the mysterious SUV. All I could tell them was that it was dark-colored, maybe navy blue or black. I had no plate number or any other identifying details. The officer was sympathetic, but said there wasn't much they could do without more to go on. I ended up staying at the truck stop until dawn, too terrified to get back on the road. Even in the light of day, I jumped at every vehicle I saw in my mirrors for weeks afterward. I still don't know who was following me that night or what they wanted. But the memory of those predatory headlights haunting my rearview mirror still gives me chills. I never drive alone at night anymore if I can help it. The fear that it could happen again is always there in the back of my mind. The car screeched to a halt, and I sat there for a moment, hands shaking on the steering wheel as I tried to process what had just happened. I'd nearly hit someone. They could have been killed. I took a few deep breaths to calm myself, then opened the car door to check if the person was okay. "Hello?" I called out tentatively as I stepped onto the road. "Are you all right? I'm so sorry I didn't see you there." At first, I didn't see anyone. The road appeared empty in both directions. But then I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. A man was standing at the edge of the trees, partially hidden in shadow. Something about his posture seemed off. He was hunched over slightly, head tilted at an odd angle. "Sir, are you hurt?" I took a few steps towards him, squinting to try and make out his features in the darkness. Suddenly, he lunged at me with shocking speed. Before I could react, he slammed into me with incredible force, knocking me to the ground. The back of my head cracked against the pavement, and for a moment my vision went dark. When I could see again, the man was on top of me. In the faint glow from my headlights, I could finally see his face clearly. His eyes were wide and crazed, teeth bared in a snarl. With a jolt of terror, I realized he was trying to bite me. I barely managed to get my arm up in time to block him. His teeth sank into my forearm, and I screamed in pain. Adrenaline surged through me as I fought to push him off. He was inhumanly strong, pinning me down effortlessly. I thrashed and bucked, but couldn't break free. His face came at me again, snapping and growling like a rabid animal. I turned my head away just in time to avoid his teeth closing on my throat. In desperation, I remembered the car keys still clutched in my hand. I swung my fist up and jabbed the keys into the side of his head as hard as I could. He let out an inhuman shriek and recoiled. Taking advantage of his momentary distraction, I shoved him with all my strength and managed to scramble out from under him. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted for the car, heart pounding in my ears. I could hear him right behind me, snarling and panting. Just as I reached for the door handle, he grabbed the back of my jacket. I spun around, swinging the keys wildly. They raked across his face, leaving deep, bloody furrows. He staggered back, howling in pain. I dove into the driver's seat and slammed the door, fumbling to get the key in the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life just as the man hurled himself at the car. His face appeared in the window, contorted with inhuman rage. He pounded on the glass with shocking strength. I was sure it would shatter at any moment. Throwing the car into drive, I floored the accelerator. The tires squealed as I peeled away, nearly losing control on the curve. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man chasing after the car with unnatural speed. but gradually he fell behind and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't slow down until I reached the main highway. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the steering wheel. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It felt like a nightmare, but the throbbing pain in my arm where he'd bitten me confirmed it was horribly real. When I finally reached home, I sat in the driveway for a long time, unable to bring myself to get out of the car. Every shadow seemed to conceal lurking danger. Eventually, I gathered the courage to make a dash for the front door, locking it securely behind me. I spent a sleepless night huddled on the couch with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. As soon as the sun rose, I went to the police station to report what had happened. The officer listened to my story with growing skepticism. I could tell he thought I was either drunk or crazy. "So you're saying some random guy tried to eat you on a deserted road in the middle of the night?" he asked, eyebrow raised. "I know how it sounds," I said desperately, "but I swear it's true. Look at my arm." I pulled up my sleeve to show him the bite mark. To my shock, there was nothing there, not even a bruise. I stared at my unmarked skin in disbelief. The officer sighed. "Sir, I think you may have fallen asleep at the wheel and had a vivid nightmare. It happens sometimes when people are overly tired. I'm glad you're okay, but please be more careful driving late at night." I left the station in a daze, doubting my own sanity. Had it really all been a dream? But it had felt so viscerally real. I could still feel phantom pain where I'd been bitten, still smell the man's foul breath. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself it had just been a stress-induced hallucination, but I couldn't shake the lingering fear. I found myself avoiding driving at night, always taking the long way home to stay on well-lit main roads. About a week later, I was reading the local newspaper when a small article caught my eye. There had been a series of violent attacks in nearby towns, all following a similar pattern. Victims reported being assaulted by a man who tried to bite them. Police were warning people to be cautious, especially on isolated roads at night. My blood ran cold as I read the details. It hadn't been a dream after all. That thing was still out there, attacking other innocent people. I considered going back to the police, but what could I tell them? I had no proof, and they'd already dismissed me once. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with researching similar incidents. I found scattered reports going back years, always in rural areas, always at night. Some described the attacker as feral and animalistic. Others swore he had superhuman strength and speed. A few even claimed he vanished into thin air when they tried to fight back. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this was no ordinary criminal. Whatever I'd encountered on that road was something beyond normal human explanation. I began to wonder if there were others like him out there, hiding in the shadows and preying on unsuspecting travelers. I never drive those back roads at night anymore, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can hear inhumans snarling outside my window. And I wonder how long it will be before that thing finds me again. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened to me. Was it some kind of escaped psychiatric patient? A rabid human driven mad by disease? Or something even darker and more inexplicable? All I know is that the world suddenly seems like a much more dangerous and mysterious place. I used to scoff at stories of monsters and supernatural creatures. Now I'm not so sure. Whatever is out there in the darkness, waiting on lonely roads, it's far more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. I still have nightmares about those crazed eyes and snapping teeth. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can feel hot breath on my neck. I've become paranoid, always looking over my shoulder and jumping at shadows. Part of me wonders if I'll ever feel truly safe again. If you're reading this, please be careful out there. Don't stop for strangers on dark roads. And if you see a hunched figure in your headlights, for God's sake, don't get out of your car. You never know what inhuman horrors might be lurking in the night, waiting for their chance to strike. Stay safe, and remember, the monsters are real. I was exhausted but excited as we piled into Jake's old SUV for the long drive home. The five of us, Jake, Megan, Chris, Emily, and myself, had spent the weekend camping in the mountains, disconnecting from technology and reconnecting with nature and each other. As we pulled onto the winding forest road, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the trees. We chatted and laughed, reliving the highlights of our trip as Jake navigated the twisting route. The headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the road ahead. As night fell completely, the forest pressed in close on both sides, creating a claustrophobic tunnel effect. A few hours into the drive, we rounded a bend and Jake suddenly slammed on the brakes, jolting us all forward. "What the hell?" Chris exclaimed from the back seat. In the headlights, we could see a massive tree trunk blocking the entire road. It must have fallen recently. There were still leaves clinging to the branches. "Damn, looks like we'll have to move it," Jake said with a sigh, putting the car in park. He and Chris got out to assess the situation. The rest of us stretched our legs, standing around the SUV. The night was eerily quiet, except for the chirping of crickets. I had an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Suddenly, dark figures emerged from the forest on both sides of the road. Before we could react, they were upon us. I caught a glimpse of ski masks and guns before rough hands grabbed me. Someone shoved a rag in my mouth and started binding my wrists behind my back. Megan screamed, but was quickly silenced. I heard the sounds of a scuffle as the guys tried to fight back, followed by dull thuds and groans of pain. Within moments, we were all subdued. Heart pounding, I was shoved face first against the SUV. One of the attackers roughly patted me down, taking my phone and wallet. Through my peripheral vision, I could see the others receiving the same treatment. "Let's move," a gruff voice ordered. "Get them in the van." I was manhandled around to the back of a windowless van I hadn't noticed before. The rear doors were open and I was unceremoniously tossed inside. One by one, my friends joined me, landing in a tangle of limbs. The doors slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. The van lurched into motion, jostling us around in the back. I could hear muffled sobs. I think it was Emily. I tried to calm my racing thoughts and take stock of the situation. My hands were bound tightly behind my back, and my mouth was still gagged. I couldn't see anything in the pitch blackness. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes or so. Finally, the van came to a stop. The rear doors opened and rough hands dragged us out one by one. In the faint moonlight, I could make out what looked like an old, run-down cabin. We were in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. Our captors, I counted 5 of them, herded us inside at gunpoint. The interior of the cabin was dusty and cobweb-covered. A single lantern provided dim illumination. We were forced to our knees in the main room. One of the men, apparently the leader, paced in front of us. "All right, listen up," he growled. "You're going to tell us the PIN numbers for your bank cards, and don't even think about lying. We'll know, and you won't like what happens then." He yanked the gag out of Jake's mouth first. Jake sputtered and coughed before answering in a shaky voice. One by one, they went down the line, removing our gags and demanding our pins. I racked my brain, trying to come up with a fake number that wouldn't be obviously false. When it was my turn, I blurted out a random sequence, praying they wouldn't call my bluff. The leader nodded to one of his men. "Take the cards and hit the ATMs in town. Clean 'em out." 2 of the attackers left, taking our wallets with them. The remaining 3 settled in to wait, keeping their weapons trained on us. An oppressive silence fell over the cabin. I tried to subtly test my bonds, but they were frustratingly secure. My wrists ached from being wrenched behind my back for so long. I glanced at my friends, seeing my own fear and desperation mirrored in their eyes. Time crawled by at an agonizing pace. I had no idea how long we'd been there when I noticed Emily squirming uncomfortably. I need to use the bathroom," she said in a small voice. The leader sighed in annoyance. "Fine, you, take her," he ordered one of his men. As Emily was hauled to her feet, I saw her eyes go wide. She'd managed to work one hand free from her bindings. In a lightning-fast move, she grabbed for the gun at the man's hip. What followed was chaos. Emily and the man grappled for control of the weapon. It went off with a deafening bang, and he crumpled to the ground with a cry of pain. The leader lunged for Emily, but Jake, who had also been working at his bonds, tackled him from behind. Chris threw himself sideways, knocking over the 3rd attacker. I struggled frantically against my restraints. Megan had managed to get free and was untying me. As soon as my hands were loose, I yanked the gag from my mouth and scrambled to my feet. Jake was still wrestling with the leader. I grabbed a heavy cast-iron pan from the rusty old stove and brought it down on the back of the man's head with a sickening thud. He went limp. "We need to get out of here," Chris yelled. "The others could be back any minute." We bolted for the door and plunged into the darkness of the forest. I had no idea which direction to go, but anything was better than staying in that cabin. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. After a few minutes of frenzied flight, we paused to catch our breath and get our bearings. The forest was pitch black and eerily silent. "Does anyone know which way the road is?" Megan asked between gasps. No one did. We were hopelessly lost. "Let's just pick a direction and keep moving," Jake said. "We need to put as much distance between us and them as possible." We set off again at a slower pace, trying to move as quietly as we could while still making progress. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. I kept imagining our attackers right behind us, closing in for the kill. We walked for hours. My legs ached and my lungs burned. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw a faint glow through the trees ahead. "Look," I hissed. "Lights!" We quickened our pace. The trees thinned, and we found ourselves on the outskirts of a small town. Never in my life had I been so relieved to see civilization. We made our way to the local police station and poured out our story to the stunned deputy on duty. Soon the place was swarming with officers taking our statements and coordinating with state police to search for our attackers. The next several hours passed in a blur of questions, phone calls to worried family members, and cups of mediocre coffee. By the time dawn broke, we were utterly drained, but profoundly grateful to be alive and safe. In the days that followed, the police managed to track down and arrest 3 of the 5 men who had attacked us. They never found the other 2 or recovered most of our stolen money. But honestly, I didn't care about that. I was just thankful we had all made it out relatively unscathed. It's been several months now, but I still have nightmares about that night. I wake up in a cold sweat, imagining myself back in that dark cabin or lost in the endless forest. I've started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma. I know it will take time to fully process what happened, but I also know how incredibly lucky we were. If Emily hadn't managed to get free when she did, if we hadn't worked together to overpower our captors, I shudder to think how differently things could have ended. These days I find myself hugging my loved ones a little tighter. I try to appreciate each moment and not take anything for granted. Life is precious and can change in an instant. That's the lesson I carry with me, a silver lining to the terrifying ordeal we endured. I still love nature and the outdoors, but you can bet I'll never take another nighttime drive through a remote forest without being hypervigilant. Some experiences change you forever. This was definitely one of them. I was staying at my dad's old house, a rundown place on the outskirts of town that had seen better days. It was eerie being there alone, surrounded by my father's belongings, but without his presence. The house creaked and groaned, settling in the cool Tasmanian night. I tried to distract myself by sorting through some of Dad's things, figuring out what to keep and what to donate. As night fell, I heated up some leftover pasta and settled in to watch TV. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Every little noise made me jumpy. I kept thinking I heard footsteps or voices outside, but when I'd look out the window, there was nothing there. Just darkness and the faint outline of trees swaying in the breeze. Around 11 p.m., I decided to try and get some sleep. I was exhausted from the stress of the move and travel. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, clear as day. Footsteps on the back porch. My eyes flew open, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone walking, trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. My heart started racing. I slowly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. I crept to the window and peeked out, but I couldn't see anyone. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the yard, playing tricks on my eyes. Then I heard another noise that made my blood run cold, the sound of metal scraping against metal. It was coming from the shed where my dad kept his tools. Someone was trying to break into the locked toolbox. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, trying to decide what to do. Should I confront them? Try to scare them off? What if they were armed? I didn't know the area well or have any neighbors nearby to call for help. I dialed 000, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the operator. I whispered that I thought someone was breaking into my father's shed. They told me to stay inside and lock the doors, that officers were on the way. Those next 15 minutes were the longest of my life. I cowered in the hallway, away from windows, straining to hear any sounds of the intruder. The noises from the shed had stopped, but I was terrified they might try to break into the house next. Finally, I saw the flash of police lights coming up the driveway. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. What if the intruder was still out there? 2 officers searched the property thoroughly while I waited anxiously inside. They found signs that someone had tried to force open the toolbox, but there was no one around. They took my statement and said they'd increase patrols in the area. After they left, I couldn't bring myself to go back to sleep. I sat up all night with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. My mind raced with possibilities. Who would try to break in on Christmas Eve? Was it just local teens looking for something to steal, or something more sinister? As the sun rose on Christmas morning, I felt utterly drained. The house that had once been my father's sanctuary now felt tainted, unsafe. I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, of vulnerability. I called my sister and told her what happened. She insisted I come stay with her family for the rest of my trip. I gladly accepted, not wanting to spend another night in that empty house. As I packed up to leave, I realized how quickly things can change. In just one night, my childhood home had transformed from a place of memories to a source of fear. The incident was a stark reminder of how vulnerable we can be, especially in rural areas where help isn't always close by. I often think back to that night and wonder what might have happened if I hadn't heard those footsteps. Would they have broken in? What were they really after? The uncertainty still haunts me. That Christmas Eve changed me. I became much more vigilant about home security, always double-checking locks and installing security systems. I also gained a new appreciation for the peace of mind that comes from having neighbors and a community around you. In the end, we never found out who tried to break in that night. The police speculated it was probably local teenagers looking for tools to steal, taking advantage of an obviously empty house. But part of me wonders if it was something else, someone who knew my father wasn't there, who thought the house would be an easy target. The experience taught me that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't fully explain or resolve. That night in Tasmania left me with questions I'll probably never have answers to. But it also showed me how quickly our sense of safety can be shattered, and how important it is to trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right. As I flew back to Brisbane a few days later, I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. I was glad to be going home, but I knew I'd never look at my father's house the same way again. It was no longer just the place where I grew up. It was now the site of one of the most terrifying nights of my life. In the years since, I've tried to focus on the positive memories of that house rather than the fear from that one night. But every Christmas Eve, I can't help but remember the sound of those footsteps and the realization that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are all too real. It was early afternoon, and we were all gathered in the living room, unwrapping gifts and enjoying each other's company. The fireplace was crackling, the tree was twinkling, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air. My husband Tom and I were on the couch, watching our two kids, 10-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Lily, excitedly tear into their presents. Our house has floor-to-ceiling windows along the back wall, overlooking the backyard and the woods beyond. It's usually a beautiful view, but on that day, it would become the source of our terror. Lily had just opened a new doll and was showing it to me when she suddenly went quiet and still. Her eyes were fixed on something outside. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, standing motionless in our backyard, was a figure in a black hoodie. They were facing the house, staring directly at us through the glass. "Mommy," Lily whispered, "who's that man outside?" I tried to keep my voice calm as I replied, "I'm not sure, sweetie. Tom, can you go check?" Tom got up and peered out the window. "I don't see anyone out there," he said with a frown, but when I looked again, the figure was still there, as clear as day. How could Tom not see them? "There's definitely someone out there," I insisted, "right there by the oak tree." Tom looked again and his face paled. "Oh God, I see them now. Who the hell is that?" Emma had noticed by this point too, and was hugging Lily protectively. "Dad, I'm scared," she said, her voice quivering. "It's okay, girls, just stay calm," Tom said, though I could hear the tension in his voice. "I'm going to go outside and see what's going on." "No!" I grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there. We don't know who that is or what they want." Just then, the figure took a step closer to the house. Even through the hoodie, I could feel their eyes boring into us. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. "We need to call the police," I said, fumbling for my phone with shaking hands. As I dialed 911, the stranger suddenly sprinted towards the house. Within seconds, they were right up against the glass, their face still hidden in shadow under the hood. The kids screamed. Tom yelled at them to run upstairs and lock themselves in the bathroom. I was frozen in terror, the phone slipping from my grasp. And then the pounding started. Boom, boom, boom. The figure was slamming their fists against the glass with inhuman strength. The whole wall seemed to vibrate with each impact. I was certain the glass would shatter at any moment. Tom had grabbed a fireplace poker and was standing protectively in front of me, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We were trapped. The pounding continued relentlessly. Boom, boom, boom. It was so loud it drowned out everything else, the crackling fire, the Christmas music still playing softly, even my own terrified breathing. I don't know how long it went on. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Suddenly, there was silence. The figure had stopped pounding and was once again standing motionless, staring at us. Then, ever so slowly, they raised one hand and pressed it flat against the glass. I'll never forget the sight of those pale fingers splayed out, separated from us by just a thin pane of glass. The wail of police sirens in the distance broke the spell. The figure's head snapped towards the sound, and in the blink of an eye, they were gone. One moment they were there, the next they had vanished into the woods. When the police arrived, they searched the property but found no trace of the intruder. No footprints in the snow, no broken branches in the woods, nothing. It was as if they had never been there at all. But we knew what we had seen. The terror was real, etched into our minds and souls. In the days and weeks that followed, we installed a top-of-the-line security system. We added locks to every window and door. We even considered moving, but this was our home, and we didn't want to let fear drive us out. Still, things were never quite the same. Every creak in the night, every shadow in the yard, sent chills down our spines. The kids had nightmares for months. Tom and I took turns staying up all night, watching the woods. But the stranger in the black hoodie never returned. To this day, we have no idea who they were or what they wanted. Was it a random act of terror, a targeted attack, or something even more sinister? The not knowing is almost worse than the incident itself. Every Christmas since then has been tainted by the memory of that day. The joy and warmth of the holiday season forever mingled with a lingering sense of dread. I find myself constantly checking the windows, half expecting to see that dark figure standing there, watching us. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can still hear the echoes of that pounding. Boom, boom, boom. We try to move on, to not let it control our lives. But deep down, we all know that our sense of safety, of home, was shattered that day, along with our Christmas spirit. And no amount of time or therapy has been able to fully piece it back together. So if you're reading this, cherish your loved ones, hold them close, and maybe, just maybe, consider getting some curtains for those big, beautiful windows. You never know who might be watching from the shadows. At first, everything was normal. John and I were sprawled out on the couch, arguing over what to watch next, when we heard a knock at the front door. I jumped up, thinking maybe our parents had forgotten their keys. But when I peeked out the window, I saw a man in a Santa Claus costume standing on our porch. "Ho, ho, ho, Merry Christmas," he called out in a jolly voice. "I've got presents for the good little boys and girls." I hesitated, confused. It was late, nearly 11 p.m. Why would Santa be here now? "Don't open it," John said firmly, coming up behind me. "That's weird." The Santa knocked again, more insistently this time. "Come on out, kiddos. I know you're in there. Santa's got lots of goodies for you." A chill ran down my spine. Something about his voice didn't sound right. It was too eager, almost manic. "Go away," John shouted through the door. "We're not interested." For a moment there was silence. Then the pounding on the door resumed, harder than before. "Don't be scared," Santa called, but his voice had lost its jolly tone. "I just want to give you your presents. Be good boys and open up." My heart was racing now. I backed away from the door, bumping into John. "Call the police," he whispered urgently. I nodded and ran to grab the cordless phone from the kitchen. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? "There's a man dressed as Santa trying to get into our house," I said in a rush. "He won't go away. We're home alone, and we're scared." "Stay calm, sweetie. We're sending officers right away. Are all the doors and windows locked?" I relayed the question to John, who did a quick check of the house. "Yes, everything's locked," I told the dispatcher. "Good. Stay on the line with me until the police arrive, okay?" I agreed, clutching the phone like a lifeline. John and I huddled together in the living room, listening to the increasingly aggressive attempts of Santa to get inside. The jolly act was completely gone now. "Let me in, you little brats," he snarled, rattling the doorknob violently. "Don't make me break this door down." I was trembling uncontrollably, terrified tears rolling down my face. John put his arm around me protectively, but I could feel him shaking too. The next few minutes were a nightmare. We heard glass shatter. He had broken a window. John grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet, positioning himself between me and the sounds of the intruder. Just when I thought he was going to get in, we heard sirens approaching. The Santa let out a string of curses, and we heard footsteps running away from the house. "The police are here," the 911 dispatcher told me. "You can hang up now. You did great, honey." I sagged with relief, but it wasn't over yet. We watched through the window as several officers chased the man down and tackled him in our front yard. It was surreal seeing Santa being handcuffed and shoved into a police car. An officer came to check on us and take our statements. He explained that they had caught the guy and we were safe now, but nothing could have prepared me for what he said next. "The man we arrested is a convicted sex offender," the officer told us gravely. "He was recently released from prison and has a history of targeting young boys." I felt sick to my stomach. The realization of what could have happened if he had gotten inside was overwhelming. In the days that followed, we learned more horrifying details. The man had previously assaulted a boy in our neighborhood. He had been watching our house, waiting for an opportunity when kids were alone. The Santa costume was his way of trying to trick children into opening the door. That Christmas Eve changed me forever. For years afterwards, I had nightmares about an evil Santa trying to break into my room. I became hyper-vigilant about locking doors and windows. Even now, over 20 years later, I still get anxious when I hear unexpected knocking. The whole incident opened my eyes to the darkness that can lurk behind seemingly innocent facades. It robbed me of some of my childhood innocence and trust, but it also showed me the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels off. I'm grateful every day that my brother and I made it through that night unharmed, but I often think about how close we came to a very different outcome. That Christmas Eve will always serve as a chilling reminder that evil can wear many disguises, even that of beloved childhood figures. Bye. The road was dark and empty, with dense forest on either side. I had driven this route countless times before, but something felt off that night. Maybe it was my exhaustion playing tricks on me, but the shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my eyes straining to see beyond the reach of my headlights. About 30 minutes from home, I rounded a sharp bend and saw headlights up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a car stopped in the middle of the road, blocking my lane. My first thought was that they'd broken down and needed help. But then I noticed a man sitting in the driver's seat, just waiting. He didn't wave or flash his lights or give any indication that he needed assistance. He just sat there staring straight ahead. Alarm bells started going off in my head. This didn't feel right. I slowed down, debating whether to stop or try to go around. As I hesitated, the man suddenly turned and looked directly at me. Even from a distance, I could see his eyes gleaming in my headlights. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to play it safe and go around. There was just enough room on the shoulder to squeeze by. As I started to edge around the car, the man suddenly opened his door and began to get out. My heart leapt into my throat. I hit the gas, swerving sharply onto the shoulder and accelerating past him. In my rear-view mirror, I saw him standing in the road, watching us drive away. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. "It's okay," I told myself. He probably just needed help and had poor communication skills. But I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that clung to me. Emma stirred and mumbled sleepily. "Are we home yet?" "Not yet, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Go back to sleep." I debated whether to tell her what had happened, but decided against it. No need to scare her over what was probably nothing. We drove on in silence for another 10 minutes or so. I had just started to relax when I saw another set of headlights up ahead. My stomach dropped. It was another car, stopped in the road just like the first one. This time it was blocking both lanes entirely. There was no way around. Time seemed to slow down as I approached the second car. I could see 2 men inside, both staring straight ahead, just like the first driver had been. My mind was screaming at me that this was a trap, that I needed to get out of there immediately. In that moment, years of survival instincts from living in Mexico City kicked in. Without conscious thought, I slammed on the brakes and threw the car into reverse. Emma jolted awake with a yelp of surprise. "Mom, what's happening?" she cried out in alarm. "It's okay, honey. Just hold on," I said, my voice tight with fear and concentration. I gunned it backwards, praying I could remember the twists and turns of the road well enough to navigate in reverse. In my rearview mirror, I saw the men from the second car jump out and start running towards us. My blood ran cold. Emma twisted around in her seat. "Mom, there are men chasing us." "I know, baby. Just stay calm. We're going to be okay." I don't know how I managed to drive backwards at high speed on that winding mountain road without crashing. Pure adrenaline and desperation, I suppose. We careened around bends, the tires squealing as I fought to keep us on the road. All the while, Emma was crying, and the sound of running footsteps seemed to echo in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, we rounded a bend, and the men disappeared from view. I kept going for another minute just to be safe, then found a wide spot in the road where I could turn around. As soon as we were facing forward again, I floored it. Emma was sobbing in the passenger seat. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're safe now," I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Can you get my phone out of my purse? We need to call the police." With shaking hands, Emma dug out my phone and dialed 911. I quickly explained the situation to the dispatcher, giving our location and a description of the cars and men. They said they would send officers to investigate immediately and advised us to drive to the nearest town and wait for a police escort. We made it to a 24-hour diner about 15 minutes later. As we sat in a booth waiting for the police, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Emma was still trembling, her face pale. "Mom, what did those men want?" she asked in a small voice. I pulled her close, wishing I could shield her from the harsh realities of the world. "I don't know, honey, but we're safe now. That's what matters." When the police arrived, we gave our statements. They were taking it very seriously, saying there had been reports of similar incidents in the area recently. They suspected it might be a gang targeting travelers for robbery or worse. An officer escorted us home, following behind our car to ensure we arrived safely. It was nearly 2 a.m. by the time we finally walked through our front door. Neither of us wanted to be alone, so we ended up curling up together in my bed, finding comfort in each other's presence. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men running towards our car. I kept imagining what might have happened if we hadn't gotten away. The what-ifs were terrifying. In the days that followed, we gave more detailed statements to detectives. They searched the area but found no trace of the cars or men. It was like they had vanished into thin air. To this day, we don't know for certain what those men's intentions were. But I'm convinced that my quick thinking and the driving skills I honed in Mexico City saved us from a terrible fate that night. The incident left its mark on both of us. Emma had nightmares for weeks and still gets anxious driving on dark roads. I find myself constantly scanning for potential threats when we're out, always on guard. But it also brought us closer together. We gained a new appreciation for each other and for life itself. And we learned that in moments of crisis, we're stronger and more capable than we ever imagined. I still drive that highway sometimes, always in daylight now. And every time I round that bend where we first encountered danger, I say a silent prayer of gratitude that we made it out safely that night. From the moment we pulled up to the curb, I knew this house was special. It had a certain charm that drew me in, with its wraparound porch and intricate gingerbread trim. The realtor, a friendly woman named Linda, greeted us warmly and began giving us a tour. As we walked through the house, I couldn't help but marvel at the stunning woodwork throughout. The banisters, crown molding, and built-in cabinets were all exquisitely crafted. Linda mentioned that the previous owner's father had been a master carpenter and had done all the woodwork himself. It was truly a work of art. While my husband and I were admiring the craftsmanship in the living room, our kids decided to play a game of hide and seek. Before we knew it, they had disappeared into the depths of the house. Linda assured us it was fine and continued showing us around. As we made our way upstairs, I heard a faint giggle coming from one of the bedrooms. I peeked inside and noticed a large wardrobe against the wall. Smiling to myself, I quietly approached and flung open the doors. Sure enough, there were my 2 little ones, crouched down and trying to stifle their laughter. "Found you!" I exclaimed, tickling them as they tumbled out of the wardrobe. They shrieked with delight, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of joy wash over me. This house already felt like home. We finished the tour, and my husband and I exchanged knowing glances. This was it. We made an offer that day, and to our delight, it was accepted. Within a month, we were moving in. The first few days in our new home were blissful. We unpacked, arranged furniture, and started to settle into our new routines. But on the 4th night, things took a strange turn. I woke up in the middle of the night to what sounded like footsteps coming from the attic. At first, I thought it might be my husband, but he was sound asleep beside me. I lay there, heart pounding, as the footsteps continued for several minutes before suddenly stopping. The next morning, I mentioned it to my husband, but he brushed it off as the house settling or maybe a raccoon on the roof. I tried to convince myself he was right, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. A few days later, while I was repainting the kids' bedroom, I noticed a small gap in the baseboard. Curious, I pried it open a bit more and found an old, sepia-toned photograph tucked inside. It showed a stern-looking woman standing next to a young boy, probably around 10 years old. They were dressed in early 20th century clothing, and something about the woman's eyes sent a chill down my spine. I showed the photo to my husband, and we both agreed it must have belonged to the previous owners. We decided to set it aside, thinking we'd return it to them if we ever got in touch. But that photograph seemed to mark the beginning of a series of inexplicable events. Objects would move when no one was looking. We'd put the kids' toys away at night, only to find them scattered across the floor in the morning. At first, we blamed our children, but they swore they hadn't touched them. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a crash from the living room. I rushed in to find a heavy marble statue that had been on the mantel now lying on the floor, a good 5 feet from where it should have been. There was no way it could have fallen that far on its own. My husband started to take notice of the strange occurrences too. He'd be working in his home office and suddenly feel like someone was watching him. He'd turn around, half expecting to see someone there, but the room would be empty. The kids began to complain about weird noises at night. My daughter said she heard a woman humming an unfamiliar lullaby. My son swore he saw a shadow move across his wall when there was nothing there to cast it. We tried to rationalize everything. Old houses make noises. Kids have active imaginations. But deep down, we knew something wasn't right. The final straw came about 2 months after we'd moved in. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and we were all in the living room. My husband and I were reading while the kids played a board game on the floor. Suddenly, we heard a loud, distinct knock coming from inside the wall. We all froze, staring at each other in disbelief. Then it happened again. 3 sharp knocks in quick succession. It sounded like someone was trapped inside the wall, trying to get our attention. My husband jumped up and pressed his ear against the wall. The knocking had stopped, but now we could hear what sounded like muffled whispering. It was too faint to make out any words, but it was undeniably there. The kids started crying, and I pulled them close, trying to calm them down while fighting my own rising panic. My husband, always the rational one, insisted on investigating. He grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement to see if he could find any explanation. I stayed upstairs with the kids, trying to distract them with a story, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. After what felt like an eternity, my husband came back upstairs, looking pale and shaken. He said he'd found an old trunk hidden behind some boxes in a corner of the basement. Inside were more photographs, letters, and a journal. As we looked through the items, a chilling story began to emerge. The stern woman from the photograph was indeed the mother of the previous owner. According to the journal entries, she had been a domineering, almost cruel woman who had kept her son isolated from the outside world. The son, the young boy in the photo, had grown up to be the master carpenter who had done all the beautiful woodwork in the house. But he had also harbored a deep resentment towards his mother. The journal spoke of arguments, of feeling trapped and controlled. The final entry, dated just a few months before we bought the house, was the most disturbing. It hinted at a confrontation, a final solution to escape his mother's influence. The writing was erratic, almost frenzied, and ended abruptly mid-sentence. We looked at each other, the same horrifying thought crossing our minds. What if the son had done something terrible? What if the knocking, the whispers, the moving objects were all signs of a restless spirit, the mother perhaps seeking revenge or justice? That night, none of us could sleep. We huddled together in the living room, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. By morning, we had made our decision. We couldn't stay in this house, not with the oppressive feeling of dread that now permeated every room. We moved out within a week, leaving most of our belongings behind. We couldn't bear to take anything from that house with us, fearing it might be tainted by whatever dark history lingered there. It's been years since we left, and we've never gone back. Sometimes I drive by the old house, and I swear I can see a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching. I always speed up, my heart racing, grateful that we escaped when we did. I don't know what really happened in that house all those years ago. I don't know if we experienced a genuine haunting or if our imaginations ran wild with an old family tragedy. But I do know that I'll never forget the terror of those 2 months, the feeling of being watched, of something unseen trying to communicate with us. To this day, I can't look at intricate woodwork without feeling a chill run down my spine, remembering the beautiful but haunted house that was almost our home. It all started when we moved into our new home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. At first, everything seemed perfect. The houses were well maintained, the lawns were neatly manicured, and the neighbors seemed friendly. That is, except for Mr. Sampson. Mr. Sampson lived in the house directly across the street from us. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair and a perpetual scowl on his face. From the moment we moved in, something felt off about him. He'd stand at his window for hours, just watching our house. At first, we tried to brush it off as the curiosity of a lonely old man, but it quickly became apparent that it was much more than that. The first incident that really made us uneasy happened about a month after we moved in. I was coming home from work late one night, and as I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Mr. Sampson standing at the edge of his property, staring at me. It was nearly midnight, and there he was, just watching. I hurried inside and told my wife, but we decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just having trouble sleeping. But the sightings continued. We'd see him peering out from behind his curtains whenever we left the house. He'd suddenly appear in his front yard when our kids were playing outside. It got to the point where we started keeping the curtains closed at all times, just to have some sense of privacy. Things escalated about 6 months into our time there. I was driving home from picking up my daughter from her dance class when I noticed a car following us. It stayed a few car lengths behind, but it was clear it was mirroring our every turn. My heart nearly stopped when I realized it was Mr. Sampson behind the wheel. I took a series of random turns, trying to lose him, but he stayed with us the entire time. When we finally got home, I saw him drive past our house slowly, his eyes fixed on us as we rushed inside. We called the police that night, but they said there wasn't much they could do. Following someone in a car wasn't illegal, and we had no proof of any actual threat. They suggested we document any further incidents and consider getting security cameras. The next few months were a blur of constant anxiety. We installed cameras, but that only seemed to anger Mr. Sampson more. He'd stand at the edge of his property, just out of range of our cameras, for hours at a time. We'd find strange objects left on our porch, old newspapers, broken toys, once even a dead bird. Each time we called the police, they'd come out, talk to Mr. Sampson, but ultimately tell us there was nothing they could do. The worst part was the toll it was taking on our family. My wife was a nervous wreck, jumping at every sound. Our kids couldn't play outside anymore. I was constantly on edge, checking and rechecking the locks, staying up late to watch the security camera feeds. Then, about a year and a half into this nightmare, my father suffered a brain aneurysm. He was rushed to the hospital, and the doctors weren't sure if he was going to make it. My whole family was at the hospital, praying and waiting for news. That's when Mr. Sampson made his boldest move yet. I got a call from our neighbor, telling me that Mr. Sampson was at our house, pounding on the door and yelling. I rushed home, leaving my family at the hospital, terrified of what I might find. When I got there, Mr. Sampson was gone, but he'd left something on our porch, a thick envelope. Inside was what looked like a lawsuit. It claimed that we had damaged his property, harassed him, and caused him emotional distress. The damages he was seeking were astronomical, nearly $1 million. It was all complete nonsense, of course, but the timing couldn't have been worse. With my father in the hospital and the constant stress of Mr. Sampson's harassment, this felt like the final straw. That was the moment we decided enough was enough. We hired a lawyer and started building a case against Mr. Sampson. We gathered all our documentation, the police reports, the security camera footage. We even got statements from other neighbors who had witnessed his strange behavior. The legal process was long and draining, but finally, after months of battles, we got the resolution we'd been hoping for. Mr. Sampson was found guilty of stalking and harassment. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation. For a while, we thought it was over. We could finally relax in our own home, let our kids play outside, and live our lives without constant fear. But we were wrong. Mr. Sampson was released after serving his full sentence, and it didn't take long for the harassment to start again. It was more subtle this time. We'd see his car driving slowly past our house, or catch glimpses of him watching us from a distance. But the fear came rushing back, as strong as ever. The final blow came just a few months ago. My sister, who had been battling cancer, passed away. It was a devastating loss for our family, and we were all struggling to cope. That's when we received notice of another lawsuit. This time, Mr. Sampson was trying to sue my sister's estate, claiming she owed him money for some imaginary debt. It was cruel, it was baseless, and it was the last straw. We're in the process of selling our house now, planning to move far away from this nightmare. But even as we pack up our belongings, I can't shake the feeling that Mr. Sampson is watching, waiting, planning his next move. I don't know why he targeted us, or what drives him to continue this campaign of terror even after everything that's happened. All I know is that I'll never feel truly safe as long as he's out there. The experience has left me paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. The quiet suburban neighborhood we thought would be our dream home turned into a living nightmare. And even now, as we prepare to leave, I can't help but wonder, will we ever truly be free of Mr. Sampson, or will the shadow of his obsession follow us wherever we go? It was already dark outside by 4 p.m., typical for an Alaskan winter. I was curled up on the couch watching TV when I heard a strange noise coming from the front door. At first, I thought it was just the wind. We often got strong gusts that would rattle the windows and doors. But then I heard it again, louder this time. It sounded like someone was trying to turn the doorknob. My heart started racing. I muted the TV and listened intently. There it was again. a distinct rattling of the doorknob, followed by a soft thud against the door. I felt my palms get sweaty as I realized this wasn't the wind. Someone was trying to get in. I quietly got up and tiptoed to the window, peeking out through a small gap in the curtains. My blood ran cold when I saw two men standing on our porch. They were wearing dark clothes and had their faces partially covered by scarves. One of them was working on the lock while the other kept lookout. Panic set in as I realized what was happening. These men were trying to break into our house, and I was all alone. I wanted to scream, but I was afraid they'd hear me. Instead, I crept to the kitchen where we kept our landline phone. With shaking hands, I dialed my mom's cell number. She picked up after a few rings. "Hello?" "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "There are two men trying to break in. I'm scared." I could hear the fear in her voice as she replied, "Oh my God, sweetie, are you sure?" Just then, there was a loud bang on the door. I jumped, nearly dropping the phone. "Yes, I'm sure. They're hitting the door now." "Okay, listen to me carefully," Mom said, her voice steady despite the panic I could sense. "Go upstairs to your room and lock the door. Hide in your closet. Dad and I are calling the police right now, and we're on our way home. Don't make any noise, okay?" I nodded, forgetting she couldn't see me. "Okay," I whispered. "Stay on the phone with me," she instructed. I crept up the stairs, wincing at every creak of the floorboards. The banging on the door was getting louder and more frequent. I could hear muffled voices now, the men talking to each other. Once in my room, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I crawled into my closet, pulling my knees up to my chest and trying to make myself as small as possible. "I'm in the closet," I whispered into the phone. "Good girl," Mom said. "The police are on their way. Just stay quiet." The next few minutes felt like hours. I could hear heavy footsteps downstairs, and then the sound of glass breaking. They were in the house. My whole body was shaking uncontrollably. I covered my mouth with my hand to muffle my breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the closet. The footsteps were coming up the stairs now, slow, deliberate steps that made the old wood creak and groan. I heard them moving around on the second floor, opening doors. They were getting closer to my room. I held my breath as I heard the doorknob to my bedroom rattle. Then came a sharp kick, and another. The chair scraped against the floor as it was pushed back by the force of their kicks. With a final loud crack, my bedroom door flew open. I could see shadows moving through the slats in my closet door. They were in my room. I don't know what came over me at that moment. Maybe it was pure terror, or maybe some primal instinct for survival. But suddenly, I found myself standing up in the closet. I took a deep breath and let out the loudest, most blood-curdling scream I could muster. The effect was instantaneous. I heard startled shouts and the sound of something heavy falling over, probably my desk chair. Then came the rapid thuds of footsteps running down the stairs. I kept screaming, my voice growing hoarse but not stopping. I screamed until I heard the front door slam shut, until I heard sirens in the distance, until I felt my mom's arms around me, not even realizing when she had arrived. The police arrived moments later, sweeping through the house to make sure the intruders were gone. They found signs of forced entry at the back door and fingerprints on various surfaces. It turned out that these men were part of a group responsible for a string of burglaries in our area during the Christmas season. They had been targeting homes they thought were empty, taking advantage of people being away for the holidays. The police praised me for my quick thinking and bravery. They said my scream had likely saved me from a potentially dangerous situation. But even with their reassurances, it took a long time for me to feel safe in our house again. For weeks after the incident, I couldn't sleep alone in my room. Every creak and groan of the house sent my heart racing. My parents installed a better security system, but it didn't do much to ease my fears. What haunted me most was the what-ifs. What if I hadn't heard them at the door? What if I hadn't called my mom? What if I hadn't screamed? The possibilities of what could have happened plagued my thoughts. It's been years since that terrifying night, but the memory is still vivid. I can still feel the cold fear that gripped me as I hid in that closet, can still hear the heavy footsteps on the stairs. This experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. But it also showed me that I was stronger than I thought. In a moment of extreme fear, I found the courage to fight back. I often wonder about those men. Did they know a child was home alone? Would it have mattered to them if they did? I'll never know the answers to these questions, and in a way, I'm glad I don't. What I do know is that I survived. I faced one of the scariest moments of my life and came out the other side. It wasn't easy, and the fear didn't disappear overnight. But slowly, with time and support from my family, I began to feel safe again. Now, when I look back on that night, I don't just remember the fear. I remember the strength I found within myself, the quick thinking that potentially saved my life. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we can find light within ourselves. I still live in Alaska, though in a different town now. And every Christmas, when the early darkness settles in, I think about that night. Not with fear, but with a sense of gratitude for my safety, for the quick response of the police, and for the strength I never knew I had. To anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation, remember this. You are stronger than you think. Trust your instincts, act quickly, and never underestimate the power of your own voice. It might just save your life, as it did mine on that cold Alaskan night so many years ago. I was driving through the mountains of Vermont with my brother Jake on Christmas Eve, heading to our parents' place for the holidays. The snow was coming down hard, making visibility poor on the winding mountain roads. We should have waited out the storm, but we were eager to get there and didn't want to disappoint our family. As we rounded a sharp curve, my headlights suddenly illuminated a horrific scene. There were multiple vehicles scattered across the road, some flipped over or smashed beyond recognition. It was clear a major accident had just occurred. My heart started racing as I slammed on the brakes, trying not to skid on the icy road. "Oh my God," Jake gasped beside me. We came to a stop and sat there in shock for a moment, staring at the wreckage. Then we snapped into action, grabbing our phones to call 911 as we jumped out of the car. The wind was howling, blowing snow everywhere as we carefully made our way towards the crash site. I could hear moans and cries coming from some of the vehicles. As we got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a young woman lying in the snow, and her lower body was completely severed from her torso. I'll never forget the sight of her there, blonde hair matted with blood, eyes wide with shock and pain. She couldn't have been more than 25. Jake and I rushed over to her, kneeling down in the bloody snow. "Help is on the way," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just hang on, okay?" She grasped my hand weakly. I can't feel my legs," she whispered. "It's okay. Don't try to move," Jake said. He took off his coat and draped it over her upper body, trying to keep her warm. I knew in my heart that she wasn't going to make it. The damage was too severe. She was losing too much blood. But I couldn't bring myself to say it. Instead, I held her hand tightly and tried to comfort her as best I could. "What's your name?" I asked gently. "Emily," she replied, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Emily, you're so brave," I told her. "Just keep squeezing my hand, okay? Focus on me." Jake was on the phone with 911, trying to explain our location and the severity of the accident. But I knew help would take a long time to reach us on these remote mountain roads in a blizzard. Emily's breathing was becoming more labored. "I don't want to die," she whimpered. "Please, I'm not ready." Tears were streaming down my face as I stroked her hair. "You're not alone, Emily. We're right here with you. It's okay to let go if you need to." She looked at me with such fear and desperation in her eyes. I wanted so badly to be able to save her, to undo what had happened, but all I could do was be there with her in those final moments. Tell my mom I love her," Emily gasped. Then her eyes went glassy and unfocused. Her hand went limp in mine. "Emily, Emily," I cried, shaking her shoulder gently. But she was gone. I broke down sobbing as Jake put his arm around me. We sat there in the snow with Emily's body for what felt like hours, waiting for emergency services to arrive. I couldn't stop staring at her face, so young and beautiful, now frozen in death. When the paramedics and police finally made it to the scene, they pronounced Emily dead and covered her with a sheet. They asked us some questions about what we'd witnessed, but it was all a blur. I felt numb and shell-shocked. Jake and I were eventually cleared to leave, as we hadn't been involved in the actual crash. But as we got back in our car to continue our journey, I knew nothing would ever be the same. The image of Emily lying there in the snow, torn in half, was seared into my mind. We made it to our parents' house late that night, but I couldn't bring myself to celebrate Christmas. How could I be joyful when I'd just watched a young woman die in such a horrific way? I had nightmares for weeks afterward, reliving those terrible moments over and over. It's been 5 years since that night, and I still think about Emily often. I wonder about her family, if they ever got closure about what happened to her. I feel guilty sometimes that I couldn't do more to save her, even though logically I know there was nothing else I could have done. The accident left lasting scars on both me and Jake. He developed severe anxiety about driving, especially in winter conditions. I struggled with depression and PTSD for a long time. We both went to therapy to try to process the trauma of what we'd witnessed. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing Emily's voice begging not to die. The holidays are especially hard. Instead of feeling merry, I'm reminded of that dark, snowy night and the life that was lost. I've tried to honor Emily's memory by volunteering at a local crisis hotline. Helping others who are struggling or in pain has been healing for me in some ways. But I don't think I'll ever fully get over what happened that Christmas Eve in the mountains. It was a stark reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change in an instant. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the risks we take every day, just by getting in a car or going about our lives. And I try to cherish every moment with my loved ones, because you never know when it might be the last. I still make the drive to Vermont each year for Christmas, but now I insist on leaving early to avoid any chance of nighttime winter driving. As we pass the spot where the accident occurred, I always say a silent prayer for Emily and the others who lost their lives that night. Their deaths were senseless and tragic, but I hope that by remembering them, some small piece of them lives on. As I was doing my final checks and getting ready to leave, my phone buzzed with a text message. I didn't recognize the number, but the content of the message made my blood run cold. "Hey, it's John. I need a ride. Can you pick me up?" John. That name brought back a flood of unpleasant memories. He was a former employee I had fired about a month ago for consistently poor performance and a bad attitude. The termination hadn't gone well. John had become aggressive and had to be escorted out by security. I hadn't heard from him since, and I had hoped it would stay that way. I stared at my phone, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I typed back a cautious reply. "John, how did you get this number?" The response came almost immediately. "Does it matter? I need a ride. It's Christmas Eve, man. Don't be a Scrooge." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Something about this didn't feel right. Why was he contacting me, of all people? And why now? "I'm sorry, John, but I can't help you. Maybe try calling a cab," I responded, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. My phone buzzed again. "Come on, don't be like that. I know you're still at the restaurant. Your car's the only one in the parking lot." I froze. How did he know that? I glanced out the window, scanning the dark parking lot. I couldn't see anyone, but the knowledge that John knew where I was sent a chill through me. "John, I'm not comfortable with this. Please don't contact me again," I typed, my hands shaking slightly. Another buzz. "All I'm asking for is a ride, and maybe we could stop by the liquor store on the way. I'm all out of booze." The request for alcohol only added to my unease. I remembered John had a drinking problem. It had been one of the reasons for his poor job performance. I didn't want to be responsible for enabling that, especially not on Christmas Eve. "I'm sorry, but the answer is no. Please don't ask again," I replied firmly. I thought that would be the end of it, but my phone kept buzzing. Message after message, each one more unsettling than the last. "You owe me this. Remember how you ruined my life? I know you're reading these. Don't ignore me. I can see you through the window." That last one made my heart skip a beat. I ducked down behind the counter, my mind racing. Was he really out there? Was this some kind of sick joke? I peered cautiously over the counter, scanning the parking lot again. It was still empty, no sign of anyone. But that didn't mean John wasn't hiding somewhere nearby. My phone buzzed again. "Come outside. We need to talk." I felt panic rising in my chest. This was more than just a desperate ex-employee looking for a ride. This felt like a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that John was seeking some form of revenge. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. As soon as the operator answered, I whispered, "I need help. I'm at the restaurant on Main Street. Someone is threatening me, and I think they're outside." The operator assured me they were sending a patrol car right away and advised me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. I hung up and immediately turned off all the lights in the restaurant, hoping to make it look like I had left. My phone continued to buzz incessantly. I couldn't bring myself to look at the messages anymore. Each vibration felt like a jolt to my system, reminding me of the potential danger lurking outside. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slowly. I stayed crouched behind the counter, my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting John to come bursting through at any moment. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerators, the tick of the clock on the wall, seemed amplified in the tense silence. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flash of red and blue lights through the window. Relief washed over me as I heard car doors slamming and footsteps approaching the restaurant. There was a knock at the door. "Police! Is anyone in there?" I scrambled to my feet and rushed to unlock the door. 2 officers stood there, flashlights in hand. "Are you the one who called about a threat?" one of them asked. I nodded, my voice shaky as I explained the situation. They listened intently, then asked to see the text messages. As I scrolled through them, showing the officers, I noticed something strange. The last few messages, the ones where John claimed he could see me, weren't there. Had I imagined them in my panicked state? The officers did a thorough check of the premises and the surrounding area, but found no sign of John or anyone else. They took my statement and advised me to block the number and report any further contact. As they were leaving, one of the officers turned to me. "You did the right thing by calling us. It's always better to be safe than sorry. Try to get home safely and enjoy your Christmas, all right?" I nodded, thanking them profusely. As soon as they left, I locked up the restaurant and practically ran to my car. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. Once I was safely inside my apartment, I blocked John's number and turned off my phone for good measure. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, jumping at every little sound, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Christmas Day came and went, and there was no further contact from John. As the days passed, I began to wonder if I had overreacted. Maybe John had just been drunk and desperate for a ride. Maybe the more threatening messages had been a product of my imagination, fueled by fear and the late hour. But even now, months later, I can't forget that night. The fear I felt was real, regardless of John's true intentions. I've since installed a security system at home and at the restaurant. I'm more cautious about my surroundings, especially when closing up at night. Some might say I'm paranoid, but after that night, I learned an important lesson. Trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And it's always better to be safe than sorry, especially when dealing with someone who might have a grudge against you. I don't know if John ever intended to harm me that night, or if he was just trying to scare me. But one thing's for certain. I'll never look at a text from an unknown number the same way again. And Christmas Eve? Well, let's just say I prefer to spend it at home now, with my doors locked and my phone on silent. It was a pretty normal evening at first. Mom was working late, and Dad was supposed to be fixing something in the garage. I was watching TV in the living room, some cartoon I can't even remember now. As it started getting dark outside, I realized I hadn't heard any sounds from the garage in a while. "Dad?" I called out. No answer. I got up and checked the kitchen, thinking maybe he'd come in for a snack or something. Empty. The garage door was closed, and when I pressed my ear against it, I couldn't hear anything. A little worried now, I decided to check upstairs. Our house always felt different at night. The shadows seemed longer, the creaks louder. As I climbed the stairs, my hand sliding along the smooth wooden banister, I felt a strange heaviness in the air. It was probably just my imagination running wild, but it felt like the house was holding its breath. I reached the top of the stairs and turned towards my parents' bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. "Dad?" I called again, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the quiet hallway. No response. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the soft creak of the hinges. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. I fumbled for the light switch, but when I flicked it, nothing happened. Great. "Dad, are you in here?" I asked, squinting into the gloom. The silence that followed was unsettling. I took a few steps into the room, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. The air felt cooler in here, and I rubbed my arms, suddenly wishing I'd worn a sweater. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the direction of the closet. My heart leapt into my throat. "Dad?" I squeaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The rustling stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own rapid breathing. Then a voice responded, But it wasn't my dad's voice. It wasn't any voice I'd ever heard before. "Yes," it hissed, low and guttural. The sound seemed to slither through the air, wrapping around me like a cold, slimy tentacle. I froze, my entire body going rigid with fear. That voice, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was too deep, too wrong, like something from the depths of a nightmare. "Who's there?" I managed to stammer, my voice shaking. Another rustle from the closet, louder this time, like something large shifting its weight. "Come, closer," the voice rasped, a hint of cruel amusement in its tone. I stumbled backward, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream, right? But the carpet under my feet felt real. The chill in the air was real. And that voice, oh God, that voice was terrifyingly real. "No," I whispered, shaking my head frantically. "No, no, no." A low chuckle emanated from the closet, the sound making my skin crawl. "Don't you want to see?" the voice asked, dripping with malice. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the dark, didn't care about anything except getting out of that room. I sprinted down the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly falling in my haste. Just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the front door opened. I screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror. "Whoa, whoa, what's wrong?" It was my dad looking bewildered as he stepped inside from the garage. I launched myself at him, wrapping my arms around his waist and burying my face in his shirt. I was sobbing uncontrollably, trying to speak, but unable to form coherent words. Hey, it's okay," Dad said, his voice gentle as he stroked my hair. "What happened? Did you have a nightmare?" I shook my head vigorously, still clinging to him. No, I managed between sobs. In your room, the closet." Dad's body tensed. "Someone's in our room?" he asked, his voice sharp. I nodded, hiccuping as I tried to catch my breath. A voice, not human, evil." Dad gently detached himself from my grip. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'm going to check it out." "No," I cried, grabbing his arm. "Don't go up there, please." He hesitated, looking down at me with concern. "Okay," he said after a moment. "We'll go together. But you stay behind me, all right?" Reluctantly, I nodded. As terrified as I was, I couldn't let my dad go up there alone. We climbed the stairs slowly, Dad in front with me, clutching the back of his shirt. When we reached their bedroom, he paused at the door. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady and authoritative. "Is someone in there?" Silence. Dad pushed the door open, flicking on the light switch. This time the overhead light came on, flooding the room with brightness. Everything looked normal. The bed was neatly made, the dresser untouched. Dad moved cautiously to the closet and slid the door open. Nothing. Just clothes hanging neatly, shoes lined up on the floor. "There's no one here, kiddo," Dad said, turning to me with a puzzled expression. I gaped at the closet, then at the room around us. But I heard it," I insisted, my voice small. "There was a voice. It talked to me." Dad knelt down in front of me, his face serious. "I believe that you heard something," he said gently. "But look around. There's nowhere for anyone to hide in here. And I was in the garage the whole time, remember? I would have heard if someone came in the house." I nodded slowly, but I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness. That voice had been so real, so terrifying. How could it just not exist? Dad gave me a hug and suggested we go downstairs for some hot chocolate. As we left the room, I couldn't help glancing back at the closet. For just a second, I could have sworn I saw the door move slightly, as if something inside had shifted. But when I blinked, it was still again. That night, I slept in my parents' room, sandwiched between them in their big bed. Mom came home late and was confused to find me there. But Dad just shook his head slightly, and she didn't ask questions. In the days and weeks that followed, life went back to normal. Dad checked the entire house for signs of an intruder, but found nothing. Mom suggested that maybe I'd been half asleep and had a vivid dream. Eventually, even I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. But sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake in my bed and think about that voice, the way it had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the malevolence in its tone. And I'd wonder, what if it hadn't been my imagination? What if something had been in that closet, something that disappeared as quickly and mysteriously as it had appeared? To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just an overactive imagination, combined with the spooky atmosphere of a dark, empty house. Maybe it was some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by stress or fear. Or maybe, just maybe, there are things in this world that we can't explain. Things that exist in the shadows, that reveal themselves only in fleeting moments before slipping back into the darkness. All I know is that I've never felt completely safe in a dark room since that night. And whenever I hear an unexpected sound in my home, especially at night, a part of me always wonders, is it back? I don't think I'll ever know for sure what happened in my parents' bedroom that night. But the memory of that voice, that presence, has stayed with me all these years. It's a reminder that sometimes the things that scare us the most are the things we can't see or understand, the things that lurk just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to make themselves known. And sometimes the most terrifying thing of all is not knowing whether what we experienced was real or just a trick of our own minds. Because if we can't trust our own perceptions, what can we trust? So I keep telling myself it was just my imagination, that there was no voice, no presence in that closet. But deep down, in the darkest corners of my mind, I know the truth. Something was there that night, something that shouldn't exist in our world. And the scariest part? I have no idea if it's still out there, waiting for another chance to reveal itself. All I can do is hope that if it is, I never encounter it again. Because I'm not sure I could handle hearing that voice one more time, asking me to come closer, inviting me into a darkness I never want to experience again. I still remember that Christmas Eve like it was yesterday, even though it's been years now. I was 16 at the time, and my parents had gone out of town for a work emergency, leaving me alone at our house in the suburbs. It was snowing heavily outside, and I was curled up on the couch watching cheesy holiday movies, trying to get into the Christmas spirit despite being by myself. Around 8 p.m., there was a loud knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I muted the TV and cautiously approached the entryway. Through the frosted glass panels, I could make out the silhouette of a large man standing on our porch. My heart started racing as I called out, "Who is it?" A gruff voice responded, "I'm here about the car for sale." I frowned in confusion. We didn't have any cars for sale. I cracked the door open slightly, keeping the chain lock engaged. The man on the porch was tall and heavy-set, probably in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket and hat pulled low over his eyes. Something about him immediately set off alarm bells in my head. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any cars for sale," I said firmly, starting to close the door. The man's demeanor suddenly changed. He shoved his foot in the doorway, preventing me from shutting it. "Come on, I know you've got a car out back. Just let me take a look," he growled. Panic flooded through me. I pushed against the door with all my strength, but he was much stronger. "Please leave. I'm calling the police," I shouted, my voice shaking. He started ramming his shoulder against the door, trying to break the chain. The wood was splintering around the lock. I stumbled backwards, fumbling for my phone with trembling hands. But in my panicked state, I couldn't remember how to dial 911. My mind went blank with terror. The man had stopped trying to force the door and was now circling the house, peering in windows and jiggling doorknobs. I ran from room to room, locking everything and closing curtains. But I knew the flimsy locks wouldn't hold him for long if he really wanted to get in. I huddled in the hallway, paralyzed with fear as I heard him stomping around on the back deck. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash of breaking glass. He had smashed the kitchen window. I let out an involuntary scream and bolted for the stairs, planning to lock myself in the upstairs bathroom. But as I reached the second floor, I heard heavy footsteps entering the house below. "I know you're in here," the man bellowed. "Just show me where the damn car is and I'll leave." Sobbing silently, I crouched at the top of the stairs. I could hear him moving through the kitchen, drawers and cabinets banging open and shut. He was ransacking the place, probably looking for keys or valuables. The stairs creaked as he started to ascend. I was trapped. There was nowhere left to hide. My legs were shaking so badly I didn't think I could even stand, let alone try to run past him. Just then, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. My uncle's pickup truck pulling into the driveway. He wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow, but he must have decided to come early. I've never felt such overwhelming relief in my life. "Hello? Anyone home?" my uncle called as he entered. The intruder froze on the stairs. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard rapid footsteps as the man bolted back down the stairs and out the broken window. I finally found my voice and screamed for my uncle. He came running up the stairs and found me huddled in the corner, shaking uncontrollably. It took several minutes before I could calm down enough to explain what had happened. We called the police, but they never found the man. They said it was likely an opportunistic burglar who used the car sale story as a ruse to case the house. But I'm not so sure. The way he fixated on that non-existent car, even after breaking in, always struck me as odd. The police dusted for fingerprints and found several clear sets, but there were no matches in their database. It seemed this guy was a ghost, no criminal record, no identity. That scared me even more somehow. My uncle stayed with me for the rest of the holiday break. We had the broken window repaired and installed a top-of-the-line security system. But I still didn't feel safe in that house. I kept imagining I saw that man's face peering in the windows at night. My parents felt terrible about leaving me alone and swore they'd never do it again. But the damage was already done. I developed severe anxiety and had trouble sleeping for months afterwards. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I heard someone breaking in. Even now, years later, I get nervous being home alone, especially around the holidays. That one terrifying night shattered my sense of security and made me realize how vulnerable we really are. I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings now, checking and double-checking locks. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my uncle hadn't shown up when he did. Would the man have just ransacked the place and left? Or did he have more sinister intentions? I'll never know for sure, and that uncertainty haunts me. The incident also made me much more cautious about interacting with strangers. I never open the door unless I'm expecting someone, and I'm wary of people who approach me when I'm alone. Some might call it paranoia, but after what I experienced, I think it's just being smart. One of the hardest parts of the aftermath was feeling like no one really understood what I'd been through. My friends tried to be supportive, but they couldn't relate to that level of fear and helplessness. It was isolating, I started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma, which helped immensely. She taught me coping strategies for managing my anxiety and helped me process the emotions I'd been bottling up. Slowly but surely, I started to feel more like myself again. But there are still moments when the memory of that night comes flooding back with vivid clarity. The sound of fists pounding on the door, the crash of breaking glass, the heavy footsteps on the stairs. In those moments, I'm right back there, that terrified 16-year-old girl convinced she was about to die. I've come to accept that this experience will always be a part of me. It changed how I view the world and my place in it. But I refuse to let fear control my life. I've worked hard to reclaim my sense of safety and independence. Now when I'm home alone, I make sure I'm prepared. I keep my phone charged and nearby. I have emergency contacts on speed dial, and I'm familiar with all possible exits. Knowledge and preparation help me feel more in control. I also channeled my experience into something positive by volunteering with a local organization that supports victims of home invasions and burglaries. Helping others who've been through similar traumas has been incredibly healing for me. Looking back, I'm amazed at how quickly an ordinary, quiet evening turned into the most terrifying night of my life. It just goes to show how fragile our sense of security can be. But I'm also proud of how I've grown and healed since then. That night doesn't define me, but it did make me stronger. So if you're reading this and you've been through something similar, know that you're not alone. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to need help, and it's okay if healing takes time. But don't let one bad experience steal your joy or your trust in the world. There's still so much good out there, as long as we're brave enough to embrace it. That first Christmas Eve, after getting the doll, I had the most vivid, unsettling dream. I was wandering through a snowy forest, lost and freezing. Just as panic started to set in, I spotted a small green figure in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was the Grinch doll, come to life. But instead of its usual scowl, it had this eerie grin plastered on its face. It beckoned me to follow, leading me out of the woods to safety. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing. I tried to shake it off as just a weird dream, but something about it felt so real. The next night, another dream. This time I was decorating a massive Christmas tree in what looked like the North Pole. As I hung ornaments, I kept catching glimpses of something green darting between the branches. Suddenly the Grinch doll popped out, cackling maniacally. It started throwing ornaments at me like weapons. I ran, dodging the flying glass balls. But everywhere I turned, there it was. I jolted awake just as it cornered me, that same creepy grin on its face. Night after night the dreams continued. Sometimes the Grinch doll was helpful, other times menacing. But it was always there, watching, waiting. In one particularly disturbing dream, I was opening presents on Christmas morning. As I unwrapped each gift, the Grinch doll was inside, multiplying endlessly. Soon I was drowning in a sea of grinning green dolls. I woke up gasping for air, feeling like I was being smothered. During the day, I started getting paranoid. I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. The doll never moved from its spot in my closet, but I swear sometimes its expression changed ever so slightly. I began to dread going to sleep, knowing what horrors awaited me in my dreams. As the next Christmas approached, the nightmares intensified. One night, I dreamed I was trapped in a giant snow globe. The Grinch doll loomed over me, shaking the globe violently. Snow swirled around me as I was tossed about like a rag doll. I could hear its cackling laughter echoing all around. When I woke up, I was tangled in my sheets, drenched in sweat. I finally broke down and told my family about the dreams. They were concerned but skeptical. My mom suggested getting rid of the doll, thinking maybe its presence was triggering something subconscious. I was hesitant. What if getting rid of it made things worse? But I was desperate for relief, so I agreed. We had a small ceremony in the backyard, burning the doll in a fire pit. As the flames consumed it, I swear I heard a faint, sinister laugh. That night, for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. No dreams, no Grinch, just blissful darkness. I thought it was finally over, but my relief was short-lived. A few days later, my younger cousin came to visit. As we played in my room, she spotted something poking out from under my bed. To my horror, she pulled out the Grinch doll, the very same one we had burned. It was completely intact, not a scorch mark in sight. My blood ran cold as my cousin hugged it, saying how cute it was. I tried to take it from her, to destroy it again, but she insisted on keeping it. My aunt thought it was adorable that she liked my old toy so much. I wanted to scream, to tell them all about the nightmares, but the words wouldn't come. As they left, I watched helplessly as the doll peered over my cousin's shoulder, its grin wider than ever. That night, the dreams returned with a vengeance. I was in a massive toy factory, surrounded by conveyor belts carrying thousands of Grinch dolls. They all turned to look at me in unison, eyes glowing red. I ran, but the belts kept rearranging, forming a maze I couldn't escape. The dolls started climbing off the belts, their tiny hands grabbing at my ankles. I woke up screaming, my legs tangled in the sheets. The next day, I called my aunt in a panic, trying to warn her about the doll. She brushed off my concerns, saying my cousin loved her new toy. I felt helpless, knowing the terror that awaited her. Over the next few weeks, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that sinister green face. As Christmas Eve approached again, I decided I had to do something. I drove to my aunt's house, determined to destroy the doll once and for all. But when I arrived, the house was dark and empty. My aunt's car was gone. I peered through the windows, searching for any sign of the doll. In my cousin's room, I spotted it sitting on her bed, staring right at me. As I watched in horror, it slowly turned its head and winked. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. I rubbed my eyes, sure I was hallucinating. When I looked again, the doll was back in its original position. But I knew what I saw. I ran back to my car and sped home, my mind racing. That night, as I lay in bed trying to make sense of everything, I heard a soft thump from my closet. My blood turned to ice as I slowly turned to look. There, sitting on top of my dresser, was the Grinch doll. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness as its head slowly swiveled towards me. The last thing I remember before passing out was its voice, raspy and cold, whispering, "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night." I woke up the next morning, convinced it had all been another nightmare. But as I got up to get ready for Christmas breakfast with my family, I noticed something green peeking out from my stocking. With trembling hands, I reached in and pulled out a small Grinch figurine. A note was attached. "Thought you might want a little Christmas cheer. Love, Santa." I dropped the figurine, watching in terror as it bounced on the floor and came to rest, staring up at me, that familiar grin plastered on its face. As I backed away, my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin. "Thanks for the awesome Grinch doll. Having the craziest dreams, LOL." My heart sank as I realized this nightmare was far from over. The Grinch doll was here to stay, haunting not just my dreams, but my entire family's. As I sit here writing this, I can feel its eyes on me from across the room. If you ever receive a Grinch doll as a gift, my advice is simple. Run. Run far away and never look back, because once it chooses you, there's no escape from its twisted Christmas spirit. As we settled in, the piercing shriek of our home security alarm suddenly shattered the peaceful silence. Jake and I exchanged worried glances before rushing to check the alarm panel. The living room motion sensor had been triggered, but when we looked around, everything seemed normal. No broken windows, no sign of an intruder. Figuring it was just a glitch, Jake reset the system and we tried to relax again. But less than an hour later, the alarm blared once more. This time, it showed the back door had been opened. My heart pounding, I clutched Jake's arm as he cautiously went to investigate. Again, nothing seemed amiss. The door was locked tight and the backyard was empty. We were puzzled and a bit unnerved, but told ourselves it must be some kind of technical malfunction. Jake called the alarm company, and they said they'd send someone out to check the system in the morning. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept imagining shadowy figures lurking outside our windows. Every creak of the house settling made me flinch. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, but relieved nothing else had happened overnight. The alarm technician arrived and spent a couple hours testing all the sensors and wiring. He couldn't find anything wrong with the system, which only increased my anxiety. If there wasn't a technical issue, what had caused those false alarms? For the next few days, things were quiet, and I started to relax a bit. But then, late one evening, as Jake and I were wrapping presents after the kids went to bed, that awful siren pierced the air once more. The alarm panel showed multiple door sensors being triggered in rapid succession. Front door, back door, side door, garage door. It was as if someone was frantically trying every possible entry point. Terrified, I grabbed the kids from their rooms while Jake called 911. We huddled together in our bedroom, listening intently for any sounds of an intruder. The police arrived within minutes and did a thorough search of the property, but found no signs of forced entry or anyone suspicious in the area. The officer suggested it could be faulty wiring, causing the sensors to malfunction. But something about the way the alarms had gone off, the pattern of trying different doors, felt deliberate to me. This didn't seem like a random glitch. The next day, still shaken, I decided to check with our neighbors to see if they'd noticed anything strange lately. Our across-the-street neighbor Tom mentioned that his security camera had caught some odd footage the previous night, right around the time our alarms were going off. He pulled up the video on his phone, and my blood ran cold as I watched. The grainy nighttime footage showed a dark figure moving stealthily across our front yard, staying in the shadows. They appeared to be testing our doors and windows, and at one point looked directly at Tom's camera before quickly ducking out of view. It was chilling confirmation that someone really had been trying to get into our home. We immediately called the police again to report what we'd seen. They increased patrols in the neighborhood but said there wasn't much else they could do without catching someone in the act. I was a nervous wreck, jumping at every little sound and constantly peering out the windows. Our quiet suburban street suddenly felt menacing and unsafe. Jake insisted on upgrading our security system, adding cameras and extra motion sensors around the property. But even with the increased security measures, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. This was supposed to be our safe haven, our little slice of suburban paradise where we were raising our family. Now it felt tainted by fear and paranoia. The kids picked up on our anxiety, asking why we were keeping all the curtains closed and why they couldn't play in the front yard anymore. We tried to stay positive around them, not wanting to scare them, but it was hard to hide our stress. As Christmas approached, I found myself unable to get into the holiday spirit. Instead of feeling merry and bright, I was consumed with worry about this mysterious intruder. Would they try again? What did they want? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing. On Christmas Eve, we had Jake's parents over for dinner. I was distracted all evening, my eyes constantly darting to the windows, straining to see if anyone was out there in the darkness. After his parents left, Jake gently suggested I try to relax and enjoy the holiday. He reminded me that nothing had actually happened, no break-ins, nothing stolen. Maybe it had just been some dumb teenagers pulling a prank. I nodded and tried to put on a cheerful face as we put out milk and cookies for Santa and tucked the excited kids into bed. But inside, dread still gnawed at me. I had a feeling deep in my gut that this wasn't over. Sure enough, at 2 a.m., the alarms erupted once again. But this time was different. As Jake and I bolted out of bed, we heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass downstairs. Someone was actually inside our home. Jake grabbed the baseball bat he'd started keeping by the bed and told me to barricade myself in the kids' room and call 911. With shaking hands, I ushered the crying, confused children into their closet and tried to calm them while frantically explaining the situation to the 911 dispatcher. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. I could hear heavy footsteps moving around downstairs, drawers and cabinets being opened and closed. Then silence. Had they left, or were they coming upstairs? Suddenly, there was a loud thud, followed by the sound of a scuffle. I heard Jake yell and what sounded like furniture being knocked over. The kids whimpered, and I held them close, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. After what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens approaching. The sounds of the struggle abruptly ceased, followed by rapid footsteps and the slam of a door. By the time the police entered, the intruder was gone. We came downstairs to find the living room in disarray, our carefully wrapped presents strewn across the floor. Jake was shaken but unharmed. He said he'd confronted the burglar coming up the stairs and managed to land a solid hit with the bat before the guy turned and fled. The police searched the area but found no trace of the intruder. They dusted for fingerprints and took our statement, but warned us that without any clear description or evidence, there wasn't much chance of catching the guy. As Christmas morning dawned, instead of the joyful holiday we'd planned, we were dealing with insurance claims and cleaning up the mess left behind. The kids were subdued, their eyes wide with lingering fear as they opened their gifts. In the days that followed, we learned that several other homes in the area had experienced similar break-in attempts. The police believed it was the work of an organized burglary ring targeting affluent neighborhoods during the holidays, when people were likely to have valuable gifts in their homes. We ended up moving a few months later, unable to feel safe in that house anymore. The experience left deep psychological scars. For a long time afterwards, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain I'd heard the alarm going off. It's been almost a year now, and things are slowly getting back to normal. But I don't think I'll ever take my family's safety for granted again. What should have been a season of joy and celebration turned into a nightmare that changed us forever. Now when I hear Christmas carols about silent nights and peace on earth, I can't help but shudder, remembering those terrifying moments when the silence was shattered and our peace was stolen away. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later with a concussion and some broken ribs. But Jake didn't make it. The guilt and grief were overwhelming. If only I'd been more careful driving. If only we'd stayed home that night. The what-ifs tormented me. The first few weeks after the accident were a blur of funeral arrangements, condolences, and sleepless nights. I couldn't bear to celebrate the holidays. Everything reminded me of Jake and what I'd lost. As the new year began, I threw myself into work, desperate for any distraction from the pain. It was about a month after the accident when I first heard it. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when a soft metallic chiming sound drifted through the room. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe wind chimes on a neighbor's porch. But it was the dead of winter, and all the windows were shut tight. I got up to investigate, following the sound. It seemed to be coming from the hallway, but when I stepped out of my bedroom, it stopped abruptly. Confused and a little unsettled, I chalked it up to my imagination and lack of sleep. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the chiming was louder, more distinct. It sounded almost like sleigh bells. My heart started racing as I remembered Jake's favorite Christmas decoration, an old set of silver bells he'd inherited from his grandmother. We'd joked about how annoying they were, but he insisted on hanging them up every year. I searched the entire house but couldn't find the source of the sound. As soon as I'd convinced myself it was coming from one room, it would shift to another. It was maddening and more than a little frightening. Was I losing my mind? Was the grief causing me to hallucinate? This continued night after night. Sometimes the chiming was faint, barely audible. Other times it was loud enough to jolt me awake. I started dreading going to bed, knowing I'd be tormented by these phantom sounds. I didn't tell anyone at first. How could I explain that I was being haunted by ghostly sleigh bells? But as the days went by and my mental state deteriorated from lack of sleep, I finally broke down and confided in Jake's sister, Megan. To my surprise, she didn't think I was crazy. Instead, she got a strange look in her eyes and asked, "Do you think, could it be Jake?" The thought had crossed my mind, but I'd been too scared to really consider it. Was my dead best friend trying to communicate with me? The idea was both comforting and terrifying. Megan suggested that maybe this was Jake's way of letting me know he was okay, that he didn't blame me for the accident. She encouraged me to try and embrace the phenomenon rather than fear it. But I wasn't ready for that. The guilt was still too raw, too overwhelming. So instead, I decided to try and stop the sounds. I researched methods for cleansing a house of spirits. I burned sage, sprinkled salt in the doorways, and even had a local medium come perform a blessing. For a few nights, it seemed to work. The house was silent, and I finally got some uninterrupted sleep. But on the fourth night, I woke up to the chiming again. This time, it sounded almost sad, like a plea. That's when something in me shifted. I remembered all the good times Jake and I had shared, how he'd always been there for me through thick and thin. If this really was him reaching out, how could I keep pushing him away? So the next time I heard the chimes, instead of panicking or trying to make them stop, I simply said, "Hey Jake, I miss you, buddy." The chiming intensified for a moment, as if in response, then gradually faded away. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. For the first time since the accident, I didn't feel alone. From that night on, I started looking forward to the sounds. They became a source of comfort rather than fear. Sometimes I'd talk to Jake, telling him about my day or reminiscing about old times. Other nights, I'd just listen to the gentle chiming and feel his presence. As the months passed, the occurrences became less frequent, but they never stopped entirely. Even now, years later, I'll occasionally wake up to that familiar sound. It's always when I'm going through a tough time or feeling particularly low. I know some people might think I'm crazy, or that I've simply found a way to cope with my grief. And maybe that's true, but I choose to believe that Jake found a way to stay connected, to let me know he's still watching out for me. The chimes remind me that love doesn't end with death. They've helped me heal, forgive myself, and find a way to keep Jake's memory alive. I've learned to embrace the unexplained and find comfort in the mysterious. So if you ever hear an inexplicable chiming in the night, don't be afraid. It might just be someone letting you know they're still there, still caring, even from beyond. Sometimes, the most beautiful messages come in the form of the unexplained. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. The chill of December air nipped at my cheeks as I walked into my high school, completely unaware of the unsettling events that were about to unfold. I was a junior then, just trying to navigate the usual teenage drama and keep my grades up. Little did I know, one of my teachers had singled me out for reasons I couldn't begin to comprehend at the time. Mr. Thompson was our math teacher. At first glance, he seemed like any other middle-aged educator, slightly balding, always wearing a sweater vest, and perpetually smelling of coffee and chalk. But there was something about the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl, even if I couldn't quite put my finger on why. It started innocently enough. He'd praise my work in class, always singling me out for answering questions correctly. At first I was flattered. Math had never been my strong suit, so the positive attention felt good. But then things started to get weird. He began asking me to stay after class to discuss my potential. These conversations always left me feeling uneasy, like there was some underlying current I couldn't quite grasp. He'd lean in too close, his coffee breath hot on my face, as he'd go on about how special I was. The Christmas party was when things really took a turn. Our school always threw this big event before winter break, with all the teachers and students mingling in the gym. I was chatting with my friends near the punch bowl when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Mr. Thompson, his eyes glassy from what I assumed was too much spiked eggnog. "There's my star pupil," he slurred, his grip on my shoulder tightening. My friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said anything. I tried to shrug him off, but he persisted. "You know," he continued, leaning in close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You remind me so much of myself at your age. So much potential." I mumbled some excuse about needing to use the restroom and practically ran away. My heart was pounding, and I felt sick to my stomach. I spent the rest of the party avoiding him, ducking behind groups of people whenever I saw him approaching. After winter break, things escalated. Mr. Thompson seemed to be everywhere. He'd, coincidentally, be in the hallway when I was at my locker, or leaving the cafeteria just as I was entering. Once, I swear I saw his car drive by my house, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Then came the day of the big math test. I had studied hard, determined to prove that I deserved the praise he'd been heaping on me. As he handed out the papers, he lingered by my desk. "I'm expecting great things from you," he whispered, his hand brushing against mine as he set down the test. I felt a chill run down my spine. After the test, he asked me to stay behind again. My stomach dropped as the last student filed out, leaving us alone in the classroom. He perched on the edge of his desk, far too close for comfort. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low and intense. "You have such a bright future ahead of you. Have you ever considered advanced placement classes, private tutoring?" I mumbled something non-committal, trying to edge towards the door. But he stood up, blocking my path. "I could help you, you know," he continued, his eyes boring into mine. "We could spend some one-on-one time together, really focus on your development." That's when I saw it. a flash of something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just academic interest. There was hunger there, a predatory gleam that made me realize I was in danger. I blurted out some excuse about being late for my next class and practically bolted from the room. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open my locker. I spent the rest of the day jumping at every sound, convinced he was going to appear around every corner. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few months. How had I not seen it sooner? The lingering touches, the accidental brushes in the hallway, the way his eyes would roam over me when he thought I wasn't looking. I felt sick, violated, even though nothing had technically happened. I debated telling someone, my parents, the principal, anyone. But what if I was overreacting? What if it ruined his career over what could be just a misunderstanding? The doubt gnawed at me, keeping me silent. A week later, the bomb dropped. I walked into school to find the hallways buzzing with shocked whispers. Mr. Thompson had been arrested the night before. The charges? Possession of illegal content involving minors. The wave of nausea that hit me nearly brought me to my knees. All those times he'd been alone with me, all those innocent touches and lingering glances, they took on a horrifying new context. I realized how close I had come to becoming another one of his victims. The following weeks were a blur of police interviews and counseling sessions. I learned that several other students had come forward with similar stories of uncomfortable encounters. Each revelation was like a knife twisting in my gut, knowing that if any one of us had spoken up sooner, we might have prevented others from being targeted. It's been years now, but I still can't shake the memory of those events. Every time I see a news story about a teacher taking advantage of a student, I'm right back in that classroom, feeling the weight of Mr. Thompson's gaze on me. I can't help but wonder, what if I had stayed behind that day? What if I had accepted his offer of private tutoring? The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I became hyper-aware of the people around me, always looking for hidden motives or secret agendas. It took years of therapy to learn to trust again, to not see every authority figure as a potential threat. But perhaps the most difficult lesson was learning to trust my own instincts. That nagging feeling I had from the beginning, that was my subconscious picking up on red flags my conscious mind was trying to rationalize away. Now, when something feels off, I pay attention. I speak up. I often think about the other students who weren't as lucky as I was, the ones who didn't manage to escape Mr. Thompson's clutches. I hope they've found peace and healing. As for me, I'm still working on it. Some days are harder than others, but I'm getting there. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this: trust your gut. If someone makes you uncomfortable, even if you can't explain why, listen to that feeling. It might just save you from a world of pain. And if you see something suspicious, say something. You never know whose life you might be saving. The events of that year will always be a part of me, a constant reminder of how quickly innocence can be shattered. But I refuse to let it define me. I'm more than a near victim, more than a cautionary tale. I'm a survivor, and I'm determined to use my experience to help others recognize and escape similar situations. So if you're reading this and something in my story resonates with you, know that you're not alone. There are people who will believe you, who will help you. Don't stay silent. Your voice matters. Your safety matters. You matter. It was late, probably close to midnight. I should have been asleep hours ago, but the excitement of Christmas morning had me wide awake. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining what Santa might bring. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. At first, I thought it was my parents doing some last-minute Christmas prep, but the steps sounded different, heavier, slower. They weren't the familiar footfalls of Mom or Dad. My bedroom door was cracked open slightly, and I could see a sliver of the hallway. As I watched, a tall male figure walked past my door. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a dark suit and hat that looked like something out of an old black-and-white movie. My heart started racing. Who was this strange man in our house on Christmas Eve? I was terrified, but also curious. I slipped out of bed and crept to my doorway, peering down the hall. The man had gone into my older brother Tommy's room across the hall. Tommy was 16 and usually slept like a rock, so I doubted the intruder had woken him up. I tiptoed across the hall and peeked into Tommy's room. What I saw made my blood run cold. The strange man was standing at the foot of Tommy's bed, just watching him sleep. He wasn't doing anything threatening, but there was something eerie and unnatural about the way he stood there, completely motionless. I must have made a small noise because the man suddenly turned and looked right at me. His face was wrinkled and weathered, with bushy white eyebrows and piercing blue eyes. But the thing that struck me most was how sad he looked. There was so much sorrow in his expression. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or cry out. Then the man gave me a small, wistful smile. He raised his hand as if to wave, and then he simply faded away. 1 second he was there, and the next he had vanished into thin air. I ran back to my room and dove under the covers, my heart pounding. I wanted to run to my parents' room, but I was afraid of what they might say. Would they believe me? Would they be angry that I was still awake? So I stayed in my bed, too scared to sleep, until I finally drifted off as the sky started to lighten. The next morning, I didn't say anything about what I'd seen. It was Christmas after all, and I didn't want to ruin the day with talk of ghosts. As the years went by, I started to wonder if I had dreamed the whole thing. But I never forgot that sad-eyed man in the old-fashioned suit. Fast forward to Christmas Eve, 2005. I was 23 now, home from college for the holidays. After dinner, the family was sitting around sharing old stories and memories. My brother Tommy, now 31, had a few drinks in him and started talking about something strange that had happened to him as a teenager. I swear, one Christmas Eve when I was about 16, I woke up in the middle of the night and there was this old man standing at the foot of my bed, Tommy said. He was just watching me, creepiest thing ever, but when I blinked, he was gone. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Wait, what? I said, my voice shaking. You saw him too? The room went quiet. My parents exchanged a look. You both saw him? My mom asked hesitantly. Over the next hour, an incredible story came out. It turned out that almost everyone in the family had seen this mysterious figure at some point over the years, always on Christmas Eve. My parents, my grandparents, even my great-aunt Mildred. But they had all kept it secret, not wanting to scare the kids or seem crazy. We have a picture of him, you know, my dad said quietly. He went to the bookshelf and pulled out an old photo album. Inside was a faded black-and-white photograph of an elderly man in a dark suit and hat. Those same piercing blue eyes stared out at me from the page. That's him, I whispered. That's exactly who I saw. This is your great-grandfather, William, my mom explained. He passed away on Christmas Eve in 1960, long before you were born. He always loved Christmas, said it was the most magical time of year. I learned that Great-Grandpa William had been a kind, gentle soul who adored his family more than anything. He had 8 children and doted on all of them. Christmas was his favorite holiday, and he went all out every year with decorations, gifts, and family gatherings. In the last few years of his life, William developed dementia. He started to forget things, including his beloved family members. By the end, he barely recognized his own children. It broke everyone's hearts to see him fade away like that. William died peacefully in his sleep on Christmas Eve, 1960. The family was devastated, but they took comfort in the fact that he passed during the holiday he loved so much. But it seemed that even death couldn't keep William away from his family at Christmas time. Every year since his passing, various family members had glimpsed his spirit wandering the halls on Christmas Eve. Always the same, an elderly man in an old-fashioned suit with sad blue eyes and a wistful expression. We think he comes back to check on the family," my grandmother said softly, "to make sure we're all okay, even though he can't be with us anymore." I was stunned. All these years, I had thought I was the only one who had seen the mysterious figure that night. To learn that it was actually a beloved family member still watching over us long after his death, it was overwhelming. From that night on, the ghost of Great-Grandpa William became a cherished part of our family's Christmas tradition. We would gather on Christmas Eve and share stories about him, both from when he was alive and the various ghostly encounters over the years. I never saw William's spirit again after that night in 1990, but every Christmas Eve I find myself glancing down the hallway, half expecting to see that familiar figure in his dark suit. And even though I don't see him, I always feel a sense of warmth and love, as if he's still there, watching over us all. Some people might find the idea of a family ghost frightening, but for us, Great-Grandpa William's spectral visits are a comfort, a reminder that love truly can transcend death. His presence, even from beyond the grave, has brought our family closer together and given us a unique appreciation for the magic of Christmas. Now, as an adult with children of my own, I often wonder if William will make an appearance to the next generation. Part of me hopes he will, that my kids will get to experience the same mix of fear and wonder that I felt that night so long ago. But even if they don't, I'll make sure they know the story of their ghostly great-great-grandfather who loved his family so much, not even death could keep him away on Christmas Eve. It's a story that never fails to give me goosebumps, even after all these years. But it's also a story that fills me with an incredible sense of love and belonging. In our family, the line between this world and the next seems just a little bit blurrier on Christmas Eve, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. I remember the first time I noticed something off about that room. I was about 8 years old, playing hide-and-seek with my cousins. I decided to hide in the kids' room closet, thinking it was the perfect spot. As I crouched inside, I heard the door slowly creak open. Peeking through the slats, I expected to see one of my cousins, but instead I saw a tall, shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was unnaturally still, and even though I couldn't make out any features, I felt like it was staring right at me. I held my breath, terrified to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, it slowly backed out and closed the door. When I finally worked up the courage to come out, the room was empty. I ran downstairs in a panic, but my cousins just laughed it off, saying I must have imagined it. But I knew what I saw. From that day on, I avoided that room like the plague. As the years went by, more strange things started happening in and around the kids' room. My Aunt Lisa was staying there one summer, and woke up in the middle of the night to find the door locked from the outside. She started pounding and yelling, waking up the whole house. When my grandpa finally got the door open, Lisa was in hysterics, insisting someone had been in the room with her. Another time, my cousin Jake was napping in there and said he felt someone sit on the edge of the bed. He opened his eyes, expecting to see one of us, but no one was there. The impression on the mattress remained for a few seconds before slowly rising back up. These incidents became so common that we started referring to it as the naughty kids' room as a way to lighten the mood. My grandma would jokingly scold the naughty kids whenever something went missing or a door slammed on its own. But deep down, we all felt uneasy about what was really going on. Last summer, I decided to stay at the farmhouse for a few weeks to help my aging grandparents with some renovations. Everything was going smoothly until one night when I was awakened by a loud thud coming from upstairs. My first instinct was to check on my grandparents, but they were sound asleep in their room downstairs. Heart racing, I crept up the stairs, telling myself it was probably just a window left open or something falling over. As I reached the landing, I saw that the kids' room door was wide open, soft moonlight spilling into the hallway. I cautiously approached, straining my eyes in the darkness. That's when I saw it, the same tall, shadowy figure from my childhood, standing motionless in the corner of the room. A chill ran down my spine as memories of that day in the closet came flooding back. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. Suddenly, it started moving towards me with unnatural speed. In a panic, I slammed the door shut and pressed my full weight against it. I could feel something on the other side, pushing back with incredible force. The wood creaked and groaned under the pressure. Just when I thought the door would splinter, everything went silent. The pressure disappeared, and the hallway was plunged into an eerie stillness. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling and gasping for breath. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door again, the room was empty. The next morning, I told my grandparents what happened. To my surprise, they didn't seem shocked. My grandpa sighed heavily and said, "I guess it's time we told you the truth about this house." He explained that strange occurrences had been happening in that room long before I was born. According to family lore, the original owners of the house had lost 2 young children to illness in that very room. Some believed their spirits never left, causing mischief and trying to interact with the living. My grandma chimed in, "We never wanted to scare you kids, so we tried to make light of it with the whole naughty kids thing. But we've all seen and felt things over the years that can't be explained." As they shared more stories, objects moving on their own, whispered conversations when no one else was home, and multiple sightings of the tall figure, I realized just how much they had been keeping from us. They had been quietly dealing with these paranormal occurrences for decades, trying to protect us from the truth. That summer, we decided to bring in a local paranormal investigator to see if we could get some answers. They set up cameras and various equipment in the kids' room, but after a week of monitoring, they couldn't find any concrete evidence of paranormal activity. The investigator said this was common, as spirits often go quiet when being actively observed. However, they did pick up some unusual electromagnetic readings and temperature fluctuations in the room. They also said they felt a heavy, oppressive energy upon entering. While it wasn't the definitive proof we were hoping for, it validated our experiences to some degree. In the end, we decided not to do anything drastic, like performing cleansings or exorcisms. My grandparents felt that whatever was in the house hadn't shown any malicious intent over the years, more mischievous than anything. They saw themselves as caretakers, not just of the house, but of whatever spirits might be lingering there. We still use the farmhouse for family gatherings, but now there's an unspoken understanding about the kids' room. We don't ignore the strange occurrences anymore, but we don't let fear control us either. In a way, the spirits have become a part of our family history, as much a part of the house as the creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear soft footsteps in the hallway, or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. And every now and then, when I pass by the kids' room, I could swear I hear the faint sound of children's laughter. It's a reminder that there are some mysteries in this world that we may never fully understand, but can learn to coexist with. The experiences in that house have fundamentally changed how I view the world. I've become more open-minded about the possibility of life beyond what we can see or touch. And while part of me will always feel a twinge of fear when I think about that tall, shadowy figure, I also feel a strange sense of connection to the history and secrets of my family's home. As I write this, I'm actually preparing for another visit to the farmhouse. My grandparents are getting older, and I want to spend as much time with them as I can. And yes, that means facing whatever might be waiting for me in the kids' room. But this time, instead of fear, I'm approaching it with curiosity and respect. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll finally unravel the mystery of the naughty kids' room and the entities that call it home. I'll never forget that Christmas Eve in northern Alberta. The memory of it still sends chills down my spine, even years later. I had decided to spend the holiday alone that year, not feeling particularly festive or social. My job at the oil fields kept me isolated most of the time anyway, so I was used to solitude. As evening fell, I grabbed a bottle of whiskey and hiked out to a secluded spot in the woods, where I often went to clear my head. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I trudged through the knee-deep drifts. The air was crisp and frigid, my breath coming out in visible puffs, but I was bundled up well in my heavy winter gear. I reached the small clearing and got to work building a fire pit, digging through the snow to the frozen ground beneath. Soon I had a decent blaze going, the flames casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. I settled in on a fallen log, taking periodic swigs from my whiskey bottle to ward off the chill. As the hours passed, a sense of melancholy settled over me. Here I was, alone on Christmas Eve in the middle of nowhere. My thoughts drifted to family and friends back home, wondering what festivities they might be enjoying. But I pushed those feelings aside, focusing instead on the hypnotic dance of the flames. It must have been close to midnight when it happened. The fire had died down to glowing embers, so I leaned forward to blow on them, trying to coax the flames back to life. That's when I heard it, a distinct wooden knocking sound coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. I froze, listening intently. For several long moments there was only silence. Then it came again, knock, knock, knock. It sounded like it was coming from about 20 yards away, off to my right. My heart began to race. I knew I was completely alone out here. The nearest cabin or structure was miles away. Could it be some kind of animal? But what creature would make such a deliberate knocking sound? I called out hesitantly, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and muffled in the stillness of the snowy forest. There was no response, just more silence. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I pulled out my flashlight and cautiously made my way in the direction of the sound, scanning the area with the beam of light. The pristine snow stretched out unbroken in all directions. If someone or something had been there, they would have left tracks. But there was nothing, no footprints, no disturbances in the snow at all. just endless white powder glittering in my flashlight beam. I did a complete circle around the area where I thought the sound had come from, but found no trace of anything that could have made that knocking noise. Thoroughly unnerved now, I hurried back to my fire pit. I threw some more logs on, building the flames up high. My eyes darted nervously around the edges of the clearing, half expecting to see some shadowy figure lurking just beyond the firelight. As I sat there, my mind racing, a chilling thought occurred to me. A few years back, a buddy of mine had gotten drunk and wandered off into the woods on a night much like this one. They found his body 2 days later, frozen to death. He had apparently gotten disoriented in the cold and darkness, unable to find his way back to safety. Could it be possible that his spirit was out here somehow, trying to warn me? The idea sent goosebumps racing across my skin. I took a big swig of whiskey, trying to calm my nerves. For the next hour or so, I sat rigidly by the fire, straining my ears for any further sounds. But there was nothing, just the crackle of the flames and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Eventually, as the whiskey worked its way through my system, I began to relax a bit. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just the cold causing a tree branch to crack, or my mind playing tricks on me after too much booze and solitude. But deep down, I knew what I had heard was real. Those 3 distinct knocks were unlike any natural sound I'd ever encountered in these woods, and the fact that there were no tracks or signs of anything in the area just made it all the more unsettling. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, I decided I'd had enough. I extinguished the fire and packed up my things, my hands shaking slightly as I worked. The hike back to my truck seemed to take forever. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me through the trees. I've never gone back to that spot since then. The memory of that night still haunts me, especially around the holidays. Was it really some kind of supernatural occurrence? A warning from beyond the grave? Or just my imagination running wild in the isolation of the frozen wilderness? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. But one thing's for certain. I'll never forget the bone-chilling fear I felt upon hearing those mysterious knocks in the darkness of that Christmas Eve. It was a stark reminder of how small and vulnerable we truly are in the face of the unknown. These days, I make sure to spend the holidays surrounded by friends and family. The thought of being alone in those woods again is more than I can bear. Some mysteries, I've decided, are better left unsolved. But on quiet winter nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I still find myself listening for that eerie knock, 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 a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. I never thought I'd find myself in such a bizarre and unsettling situation, especially on Christmas Eve. It all started a few months ago when I began working at a local restaurant. The job itself was pretty standard, taking orders, serving food, the usual stuff. But there was this one coworker, John, who always seemed a bit off. John was terrible at his job. He'd constantly mess up orders, forget to bring customers their drinks, and sometimes even argue with the patrons. I tried to help him out at first, but it quickly became clear that he wasn't interested in improving. He'd just shrug off any advice and continue doing things his way. As you can imagine, management wasn't too thrilled with John's performance. After numerous complaints from customers and several warnings, they finally decided to let him go. I remember the day it happened. John caused a scene, yelling at the manager and knocking over a chair as he stormed out. It was uncomfortable for everyone, but I figured that was the end of it. Fast forward to Christmas Eve. I was at my parents' house, enjoying time with my family. We had just finished dinner and were settling in to watch some holiday movies when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hey man, it's John from work. What's your address?" I was immediately confused. Why would John be texting me? We weren't friends, and I certainly hadn't given him my number. I decided to ignore it, thinking maybe he'd sent it to the wrong person. A few minutes later, another text came through. "Come on, I know you're there. Just need your address real quick." This time I felt a slight chill run down my spine. How did he know I was there? I tried to push the thought aside and focus on the movie, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. About half an hour passed before my phone buzzed again. This time the message read, "Look, I'm not trying to be weird. Just need you to buy me some booze. I'll pay you back." Now I was really perplexed. John knew I was only 20. I couldn't legally buy alcohol. Plus, why would he ask me of all people? We barely knew each other. I decided to respond, hoping to put an end to this strange exchange. "Sorry, John. I think you have the wrong number. I can't buy alcohol anyway. Merry Christmas." I thought that would be the end of it, but boy, was I wrong. Within seconds, my phone lit up again. "Don't lie to me. I know it's you. Just tell me where you live, and I'll come pick it up." My heart started racing. This was getting creepy. I showed the messages to my dad, who advised me to block the number. I did, hoping that would be the end of it. For about an hour, everything was quiet. I started to relax, thinking maybe John had given up. But then, my phone rang. It was another unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, my hands shaking slightly as I waited for the notification. The voicemail notification popped up, and I hesitated before playing it. John's voice, slurred and angry, filled my ear. "Listen here, you little shit. I know you're there. I know you can hear me. Stop ignoring me and give me what I want. You owe me after what happened at the restaurant." I felt my blood run cold. How did he get another number? And what did he mean, I owed him? He was the one who got himself fired. I played the message for my family, and we decided to call the police non-emergency line. They took down the information, but said there wasn't much they could do unless John actually showed up or made a direct threat. Throughout the rest of the night, I received more texts and calls from different numbers. Each message became more incoherent and threatening. "I see your car in the driveway. Nice Christmas lights. You can't hide forever. I know where you work. Remember that time you spilled coffee on table 7? I covered for you. You owe me." That last one really freaked me out because it was true. I had spilled coffee once, and John had helped clean it up. But I never thought he'd use that against me. As the night wore on, I became increasingly paranoid. Every sound outside made me jump. Was that a car door slamming? Footsteps on the porch? I kept peeking out the windows, half expecting to see John's face pressed against the glass. My family tried to keep things normal, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. We went through the motions of opening presents and singing carols, but my mind was elsewhere, constantly wondering when the next message would come. Around midnight, things took an even stranger turn. I received a picture message from yet another unknown number. With shaking hands, I opened it. The image showed a crudely drawn map with an X marked on it. The text below read, "Found you. Merry Christmas, asshole." That was the last straw. We called the police again, this time insisting they send someone out. While we waited, my dad and uncle took turns patrolling the perimeter of the house, making sure all doors and windows were locked. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. We showed them the messages and explained the situation. They took it seriously, thank goodness, and promised to keep an eye on the house throughout the night. They also said they'd try to trace the numbers in the morning. As the officers were leaving, one of them suddenly stopped and pointed at something in the front yard. There, stuck in the snow, was an empty vodka bottle with a note tied around it. The officer carefully retrieved it, wearing gloves to preserve any potential evidence. The note, written in messy handwriting, simply said, "Thanks for nothing. See you at work." I felt my knees go weak. John had been here, right outside my family's home, while we were inside celebrating Christmas. The thought made me sick to my stomach. The rest of the night was a blur. Nobody slept much. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every little noise. I kept expecting my phone to buzz again, but it remained eerily silent. When morning finally came, there was no sign of John. The police returned and took the bottle as evidence, promising to dust it for fingerprints. They also managed to trace some of the numbers. Apparently, John had been using a bunch of burner phones. Days passed, and we didn't hear anything more from John. I was too scared to return to work, so I called and quit over the phone. My boss was understanding, especially when I explained the situation. It's been a few months now, and there's been no sign of John. Sometimes I wonder if it was all some sort of twisted Christmas prank. But then I remember the fear I felt that night, the way my heart raced every time my phone buzzed, and I know it was all too real. I still jump when I get a text from an unknown number. I've changed my phone number twice since then, and I don't think I'll ever look at Christmas Eve the same way again. What should have been a night of joy and celebration turned into a nightmare that I can't seem to shake. The police never found John. Sometimes I worry that he's still out there, waiting. But mostly, I try to move on with my life, grateful for the safety of my family and the quick response of the police that night. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I could swear I hear the faint buzz of a phone notification. And for a split second, I'm right back there on Christmas Eve, terrified of what might be waiting for me on the other side of that message. I was on hour 6 of my solo road trip across the country, cruising down a long stretch of empty highway somewhere in the middle of Nebraska. The sun was starting to set, casting an eerie orange glow across the endless cornfields on either side of the road. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour and was starting to feel that creeping loneliness that comes from too much time alone with your thoughts. That's when I spotted him. A lone figure walking along the shoulder up ahead, thumbs stuck out. Now, I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers. My mom always warned me about the dangers when I was growing up. But something about the isolation of that empty road and my own growing unease made me slow down as I approached. The guy looked harmless enough, probably in his late 30s, average build, wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt. He had a small backpack slung over one shoulder. As I pulled over, he jogged up to the passenger side with a friendly wave. "Hey there, thanks for stopping," he said as I rolled down the window. "Name's Tom. Any chance you're headed east? I'm trying to make it to Des Moines." I hesitated for a moment, but figured what the hell. Some company might do me good. "Yeah, I can take you as far as Omaha at least. Hop in." Tom tossed his backpack in the back seat and settled into the passenger seat with a grateful sigh. "Man, I really appreciate this. Been walking for hours trying to catch a ride." We made small talk as we continued down the highway. Tom told me he was headed to visit family in Iowa. I shared a bit about my cross-country trip. He seemed friendly enough, asking questions about where I was from and what I did for work. But after about 30 minutes, I started to get an uneasy feeling. Tom's questions were getting more personal, probing for details about my family, where I lived, if I had a significant other waiting for me back home. I tried to keep my answers vague, but he kept pressing. "So you live alone then, in an apartment or house?" he asked, a strange intensity in his eyes. I have roommates," I lied, not wanting to admit I lived by myself. Tom nodded, his gaze lingering on me a bit too long before turning back to the road. A chill ran down my spine. Why was he so interested in my living situation? I tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics, but Tom kept bringing it back around to uncomfortably personal questions. Where exactly was I staying tonight? Did I tell anyone back home about picking up a hitchhiker? My palms were sweating on the steering wheel as my mind raced. Had I made a terrible mistake letting this stranger into my car? The sun had fully set now, leaving us in darkness broken only by my headlights and the occasional passing car. I was looking desperately for any excuse to end this ride early when I spotted a sign for an upcoming rest stop. "Hey, I need to use the restroom and grab some coffee. Mind if we make a quick pit stop?" Tom's face tightened almost imperceptibly before he forced a smile. "Sure thing. I could use a break myself." I pulled into the brightly lit rest area parking lot, my heart pounding. As soon as I put the car in park, Tom's hand shot out and grabbed my arm. "Why don't you leave the keys in the ignition? I'll keep an eye on things while you run in," he said, his tone light but with an unmistakable edge of menace. I froze, realizing with horrible clarity the danger I was in. This guy clearly had bad intentions. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. "Actually, I think I left my wallet in the trunk," I stammered. "I need to grab it to buy coffee." Tom's grip tightened painfully on my arm. "I don't think that's necessary. Why don't we just get back on the road?" Panic rising in my throat, I made a split-second decision. I yanked my arm free and bolted from the car, sprinting towards the rest stop building. I could hear Tom swearing and fumbling with his seatbelt behind me. I burst through the doors, gasping for breath. There was only one other person inside, a middle-aged woman behind the counter who looked startled by my sudden entrance. "Please, you have to help me," I wheezed. "The guy I picked up hitchhiking. I think he's dangerous. Can you call the police?" The woman's eyes widened in alarm, but she quickly nodded and reached for the phone. Just then, Tom came sauntering through the doors, his face a mask of concern. "Hey, buddy, is everything okay? You took off running so fast I was worried," he said, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. I backed away, putting the counter between us. "Stay back. She's calling the cops right now." Tom's friendly facade dropped instantly, replaced by a look of cold fury. He glanced between me and the woman on the phone, clearly weighing his options. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might try to physically overpower us. But then we heard the distant wail of police sirens, and Tom bolted. He ran back to my car, grabbed his backpack from the back seat, and took off into the darkness beyond the rest stop. I sagged against the counter in relief, my legs shaking. The woman came around and put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "It's okay, hon. The police will be here any minute. You're safe now." When the cops arrived, I gave them a full description of Tom and told them everything that had happened. They took my statement and said they'd put out an alert for him. I ended up having to stick around the rest stop for hours, answering questions and filling out paperwork. It was nearly dawn by the time they finally said I could go. One of the officers walked me out to my car. "You're lucky you trusted your instincts and got out of there when you did," he told me gravely. "We ran the description you gave us through our database. Looks like this Tom matches the profile of a guy wanted for a string of assaults and possible homicides across 3 states. He's been preying on lone travelers, especially in remote areas. I felt sick to my stomach imagining what could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. The officer must have seen it on my face because he gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You did the right thing. Thanks to you, we've got a fresh lead on this guy. We'll catch him." I nodded numbly and got in my car. As I pulled back onto the highway, the vastness of the open road that had seemed so exciting yesterday now felt ominous and threatening. I kept obsessively checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see Tom's face pop up in the back seat. It took me days to stop jumping at every sound and shadow, weeks before I could sleep through the night without nightmares. Even now, months later, I still get a chill down my spine whenever I pass a hitchhiker on the side of the road. I'll never know for sure what Tom's true intentions were that night, but I'm certain that if I hadn't trusted my gut and found a way to escape, I might not be here to tell this story. It was the closest I've ever come to true evil, and an experience I'll never forget as long as I live. So let my story be a warning. No matter how lonely that open road might feel, no matter how harmless a stranger might seem, never let your guard down. You never know who might be hiding behind a friendly smile, waiting for their chance to strike.